Hello, Silas here. This is the third time we're trying this. I'm back with my friend Steven. Say what's up to everyone.
Hello, everyone.
We're here for our conversation series, and today we're going to be starting a conversation on the book Why We Believe in Gods, a concise guide to the science of faith. And this is by J. Anderson Thomson, Clare Aukofer. I think it's Aukofer.
The German in me the German in me wants to say Aukofer, but I don't know how she says it.
But I think it seems to be a Nigerian name, but I've seen
Oh,
Okafor, but I think it's Alcofer, and then Richard Dawkins, who's more known to people who would be familiar with this kind of atheist, religious kind of
yeah.
speaking thing. I'm not familiar with John Anderson Thompson or Clay Alcofor before, but I'm just going to kick it over to Stephen and tell us a bit about how he found this book and what it's about, and just lead us into this. So go ahead.
Sure. So he works for the Richard Dawkins Center or Institute, I think it's called. He actually did this work for them, and he has a background in individual analytic psychotherapy and also forensic psychiatry. So trying to understand how psychology evolved in the past based on what we know about archaeology and anthropology, but also how that relates to psychiatry. So certain drugs people may have taken, how that interacted with certain things, that how like what their reasons for taking those things, for example, like tribes taking mushrooms, things like that. That's that's the nature of his research. That's not specifically what the book's about, but he delved into that. So I found out about this book via James Lindsay. James Lindsay mentions it in another one of his books. He made the point. He said it's a very short but concise book. This book is only about 98 pages long, I think, but a lot of good information in a pretty short time. 10 chapters in total. The book explores from an evolutionary psychology and also um, neuroscience standpoint, basically why we evolved to believe in gods and other divine beings. And we'll get into this more and more as it goes on, obviously, but it gets into things such as why do people believe there's something supernatural? Why do people believe in rituals? Why do they believe the rituals can help communicate? Um, Certain mental shortcuts we take when we can't figure things out, et cetera, et cetera. He does a very good job of piecing all of this together in a pretty short and easy to understand manner. But when you walk through step by step, you think, okay, this makes perfect sense. This is why our ancestors and people today still believe strongly in religion.
Cool.
Yeah.
So his field seems like a bit of like an anthropology meets evolutionary psychology. It's
Yeah.
on more the psychology rather than the psychology, because it's a bit of a difference. Like if you go to a psychologist and a psychiatrist, they're
Yeah.
kind of different. It's a different bit of a different beast. Okay, so that's it's something that is very interesting to me. I think part of how I got more into this infosphere online was in part through the atheism community. That was one of the earliest. I think it was one of the earliest, rather well defined and growing infosphere online. I think in the earlier times, in the year 2000, Conan, it's like going into that, and there was a lot of thought and idea coming into that. That's why I became familiar with Christopher Hitchens, with Richard Dawkins, and Daniel Dent. Some of these people that are still speaking. Of course, Christopher Hitchens has passed away, but still working into this. We had faith with us for a long time. I don't think the idea of gods is something that began with faiths and beliefs. Faith and belief in those things precedes gods, precedes theologies. And I think it will continue post God, post theology. Like relatively atheists who are, no, not relatively atheists. I guess they technically atheists because they don't have a full out like identity, like following a certain theology, but they are very religious. They have a lot of faith. They're very faith based in their behavior, and they have strong beliefs. And even personally for myself, I consider myself a religious, but I still have things I believe in. I still have certain things that I have faith in, and I think we'll get to discussion of use some examples to what I think the difference between belief and just faith is. But what are your thoughts on that in general?
Well, I've made the point too. It's also important to emphasize the difference between when people will use the word faith, but they may not mean that in the literal definition. Like people will say, I have faith in myself, but there's a distinction between faith versus confidence, and confidence is reason based on the facts of reality. So it's, I have faith I can do this. People say that, but that's actually a misnomer, because faith would be based on things you necessarily can't prove. You're just taking the leap of faith, as it were. Whereas if you have confidence you can do something, you're likely drawing upon past successes, you're weighing your own skills, all that. So that's based on the facts of reality. That's not faith. And I think people misuse the word sometimes. I do think that I'll get more into this as the discussion goes on, but of course, a lot of the ideologies we've talked about, like critical race theory and intersectionality, those are heavily faith-based ideologies, because there's a lot of ideas about you can't ask for evidence, you just have to go along with what somebody tells you. There's a lot of deference to authority, and that's sort of my ongoing criticism about these are the same people who will say religions are irrational and dogmatic and all this, but they don't see the same tendencies in their own thinking. Now, as you and I have discussed before, they're not religious in a sense. There are no mystical beings, there's no all-powerful God, there are no saints, there's no magic, there's no miracles, but it's still religious in the sense that dogma that can't be questioned, things that are taken on faith, scripture that is deferred to, leaders that can't be questioned, et cetera, et cetera. So there are far more parallels to the religions than they want to admit, even though they claim to be anti-religion.
Yeah. And as we've had, I think when we did the critical theory one, I think also, which was the other one that you did? I think Ivory Tower might have had a definitions one. We did a separate one. We're talking about this core definitions to some of the key topics that were actually key content what you're talking about. So I think I will record a separate one where we'll just get find some dictionary definitions of faith and belief, and then also just list some of our personal beliefs. So use those words because they not be exactly like it, or there's different parts, it'd be like part one, part two, then now the adjective, different things and different uses. So it's okay if we're using it in this sense, somebody else might be using it in this way. So I think that will be helpful to include that as one of these, and we'll try to record that sometime soon. But I think just now off the top of my head, I want to give two definitions to one of those things, and these are mostly borrowed from other people. Mostly borrowed from Matt Daly, and I think he has a really good definition of what he means when he talks about faith in the religious sense. And he says, this might be offensive to some people, but faith is a excuse to give when we don't have any evidence. And I think that's appropriate in that sense. People say, I say that X, that this is going to happen in that sense. Because if you had actual evidence, if you had actual something else, you would say, I have faith that this is going to happen because of this.
Yeah.
Have evidence to actually support why you feel or believe or want to state that has happened, have that confidence, you'll say God. You'll just add that in there. And I think when it comes to the religious sense, that is something that I find to be faith. What do you think of that definition of faith, and that's in the religious sense?
Yeah, I thought of an interesting there's people of course know that I'm big fan of Wilfred Riley. If you follow my feed, I post a lot of his stuff. He had an interesting tweet yesterday, which I posted, that sort of ties into both these things. He says, I intensely dislike philosophies from hard critical race theory to the Vale of Tears take on sin that create a useless framework within which to do empirical analysis. Then he says in quotes, sure, age, region, test scores, and a dad at home totally predicts success. But will God, the whites, let us marry? And then I posted this, and my friend was kind of asking, I was saying, the problem with things like this is that some of these people will be claiming to do empirical evidence and claim that there's evidence that supports their beliefs, but they're still doing it within this framework, and they're still looking for evidence that conforms to the framework. So if you're looking for evidence that conforms to the framework, are you really looking for evidence? It's the whole Karl Popper falsifiability thing. It's if it can't be proven false, well, anything can be taken as proof. If anything can be taken as proof, what's the standard for proof? If the standard of proof is pretty much whatever you want, well, proof becomes meaningless. If proof is meaningless, it's an evidence-free ideology. So we're just back to taking everything on faith and throwing out evidence. So even if you try to tie evidence into a lot of this stuff, it doesn't really work either, because it can't be proven wrong. It looks at what does the ideology say, what did the thought leaders say.
Yeah, that is good. And I guess we'll see that when you get the actual definition of faith out there, because I think that tying it outside of evidence, and the thing that I came from, I saw that video on it, was there is no empirical evidence that anybody needs empirical evidence to believe that they have empirical evidence for their beliefs. And that seems to be a constant thing where I'm thinking about certain things I used to believe, and standards, and right now we have some issues here. It's like there's some thunderstorm going on in the background, so I just have some faith if you're going to be able to actually keep this recording going. But normally when it rains, it is a high that the power go out. Sometimes we'll actually have these recordings and like, okay, Steven, we can't really record right now because I just have this feeling that the power is going to go out. There's going to be something going on. And with this kind of, I don't know if you'd be able to consider that I have less faith that I'll be able to get a full recording in when there's actually thunderstorm because of just the past behavior, that's the past data that there's a thunderstorm, especially thunderstorm. Rain is one thing, but the thunderstorm just ratchets up the chances that there's going to be a power outage here in Nairobi, Kenya, where I'm recording it. Now, that could be something to do with, it could be a power outage where I'm at or somewhere else down the line, and it's knocking down the cables and making things weaker and things. So there's all these considerations to have. I don't know if that would be a faith thing or a belief. There's some kind of trusting, and it's a tough term to kind of have people understand. When it comes to like the actual belief things and the evidence thing, I don't know how much evidence it takes for somebody to believe a certain proposition. It depends on the situation. It depends, I think, how much someone's invested in something. If someone is, like with the whole situation right now, having this record, I believe in New York, that's what, he's in New York, he's in his room, I have a certain belief. I believe that I'm talking to Steven right now over this computer magic type of thing. There's an undersea cable, or there's the satellites and all that. I believe that is the situation. But if he comes and he starts saying like, no, this is actually the aliens have abducted me, and I'm in a room that's made to look like an apartment, and I'm not leaving. This is some big experiment for the aliens to try and collect information on humans. Like, I wouldn't believe that. There's no reason for me to actually believe that. Now, if I saw an alien walking in the background, I don't know if that's enough evidence for me to believe it. I can still think that could be somebody in a suit, that could be something else. Do I have faith that there actually are aliens in the world, even though in existence? I would say that might be some faith-based proposition that I don't think it's impossible that could be true, that aliens could have abducted Steve, because I'm thinking if they are aliens advanced enough to make it to Earth and actually be here, I would believe that would have the ability to simulate a room to look like Steven and have to do that live and things like that. So that might be a faith-based thing. I have faith that aliens exist. But for me to believe Steven has been abducted by those aliens that have faith exist, even though I don't have any evidence for those aliens existing, still a level of evidence from a simple faith-based proposition to something that I could believe in. If that jumbled nonsense makes any sense, I don't know.
Well, because like, okay, when I posted this book, somebody near and dear to me got upset, and they sent me this whole text about Jesus is our Lord, et cetera, et cetera. And then they said, oh, if he appeared in Times Square, people still wouldn't believe it. And it's like, okay, but you see the problem. On the first hand, you're arguing, take on faith that Jesus was the Son of God, our Savior, et cetera, et cetera. And then you're saying, oh, there could be evidence for him and you wouldn't believe it. But no, you're changing the standard of proof now, because before you're telling me take on faith based on what's written in religious text written long ago versus, okay, if I physically see him with my own eyes and everything, well, that's physical proof. I'm not going to reject physical proof. I'm rejecting faith. So, it's a question of epistemology. But then I have these arguments too with other religious people where they'll say, don't, you need your faith, but then they'll say there's evidence for this. And it's like, well, which is it? It's like faith often just becomes a way of sort of getting out of it's things that I want to believe but can't prove. And that's one of my issues. Oh.
Yeah, and I feel that's how, not just I feel, it's in my experience, that's how it's often used.
Yeah.
That term is often used when there is no evidence, when people are at the end of the road, when they don't want to just say I don't know, or
Yeah.
and that's the kind of thing where you often hear people say in certain debates, oh, but we want to take faith away consolation. I think, yeah, like I think it's false. I think it's false consolation. I wouldn't want somebody to believe or because I think there actually is the ability to to have, and this could be just me projecting my experience, but I think realizing being closer to is better than
Yeah.
having that solace from something that I think is demonstrably false, or that there's no actual evidence to actually have that strong belief into it. And because it's not simply a belief, because if it's just a personal belief, if it's just faith, then why even state it? Why even hold it? Why even account for it if it's not something that's actually going to influence your actions? When it comes, I am the case that it's almost impossible to have something like a personal belief when it really comes down to it, because we are social animals and we do act in society.
Mm.
Still having some slowdown, probably.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
it was a little clearer for a sec. You occasionally have these moments where it's a little clearer, and then it kind of fades and freezes a little.
okay. So we'll just keep going with the recording for those listening. Thank you. I might do some editing where I'm cutting things down. We're talking with Stephen. With these conversations, if you've been watching your conversation series, I like that we can just have a full-on recording straight on without having too many edits in it. But sometimes we have some of these issues, and just trust to get it as best as we can.
Sure.
So yeah.
All right.
One.
So,
Go ahead.
did you have anything else, or should we just jump right into the book?
Yeah, and one last thing. This is something that I've been thinking about for a few times. I'm going to do a small animatic to go along with it to why I think it's to have conversations about these things, and why I don't think people should just be allowed to just go back on the whole thing. Eventually, when people choose to actually engage you on their beliefs and one of the things that they have faith on, specifically theologies, I think the people who are willing to engage on it,
Yeah.
but often they get to the point where they say, but it's just personal. Like what
Yeah.
what do you care? Why are you trying to take this away from me? Why are you trying to take this away from other people? But that case I was trying to make, where there's hardly anything like a completely personal belief. I'll just go with this example, and just bear with me as I try to. I've done a small outline. I want to get it condensed down to do a small animation to go with it. So a basic one is something like this, that most people think. They say, okay, I believe my mother is the most beautiful. That's something that most people think, you're kid, you're born, that someone says that's a belief that they have. Most people, if they hear that, they think it's rather innocuous. Now,
Yeah.
there might not be these actual, I think, objective things to say, is this person objectively beautiful? Like, if you actually went and you did some kind of ranking thing, you could actually get to a thing where you're like, okay, your mother was really not attractive objectively compared to all these other people. And if she wasn't your mother, but people understand as the
Yeah.
personal reasons of why you might feel that way, that's your mother and things like that. So that's at the general statement. It's like, okay, it's a personal thing. Most people don't object to somebody just making that statement. They won't say, where's your evidence? Let me see a picture of your mother. Like, are you sure? Have you seen this person's mother? Have you seen that one? No,
Yeah.
Nobody really gets to that point when somebody says that. Now, if somebody says, okay, my mother is the most beautiful woman in the world, so women who look like my mother are the most beautiful women, and those are the women that are for me. Now that gets to a point where if somebody is dating that person, if somebody likes that person, now that gets to be more a social thing. It starts changing how they act, who they react with. Then what level they look at their mother? Looking at the mother as the 30-year-old that met them, they understand the person now? Is it like, okay, like for my mother, for example, she's like 5'2", she's got black hair, she's got melanin in her skin and things like this. She's the body shape and things like that. So you start thinking, okay, those are the things that you start, and they start shaping who you actually find attractive, who you actually date and deal with, and things like that. And now the people who want to date you, they might have some, like, why are you only focused on that when there's these other people like this? There might be this other person that has many valuable traits, but you're focused on just this physical appearance because of that belief system that you have. So now that gets to a point where it's a personal belief, but now some other people might have some questions of why you actually hold that belief to be true. Now that might need to take more evidence, more comparison in that sense. Now, if you get to the point where that person, you with that mindset, end up getting a position of power, maybe you're a dictator or something, and you start saying, this woman this is what the most beautiful woman is supposed to be like. This person who is like my mother, that's who actually ends up being the best person to take care of children. So I'm going to get to the point where I'm going to start dictating that only people who are like my mother, who are in this kind of position, are the ones who are allowed to have marriages, who are allowed to reproduce, who are allowed to focus on this. And you start saying this is the perfect kind of person. And you start projecting that to other people and start changing other people's lives. Now, when it gets to that point, that's something where it's like, okay, like that's, now I really have to raise my hand and say, why are you preventing my daughter? Why are you preventing me from marrying somebody else? Why are you stopping this? Why are you giving preferential treatment to this kind of person? From that initial belief that you have that your mother is the most beautiful person, something like that can go on. Now, I'm going to figure out a way to streamline that thing into a bit, but you can see something like that in that recent situation in 1930s in Germany with that failed painter who had a certain idea of who he's supposed the perfect human or top kind of human. If somebody just thinks that in general, who really cares if you like blonde, blue-eyed people? Like, okay, if you think that's the most attractive, that's one thing. If you decide you're just going to date blonde-eyed, blue-eyed blonde people, that's okay. That goes to another level. Now, if you get the level of control and then you start saying, I'm going to generate a society of blonde, blue-eyed people, that starts infringing on other people's actual actions. And so that's kind of what I'm saying. Like something could just be a rather subjective, innocuous belief that through the actual way it affects the humans who actually hold those beliefs could actually really have a lot more influence in the rest of the world. So I think it's good to base your actual beliefs, and with your beliefs, I don't really know what it takes to believe something. I think you either believe something or you don't. I don't know if you have that much control. I don't know when it gets to the point where I've eaten enough Oreos to say like I believe Oreos are my favorite kind of cookie. Like I don't know what bite of Oreos. Is it like bite number 300 where it's like, okay, that's enough evidence? It's like all of a sudden that's a belief, where before that bite I was like, okay, like, I could have these other cookies, but then it gets to a point. So with that actual thing, I don't know exactly when belief happens. I don't know exactly how falling out of belief occurs, but that's probably why I'd be very excited to see what happens in this book when this person's actually taken some more look into beliefs, into something very specific with gods, because gods is more than a cookie. Gods is how the world came to be. And if you have a certain belief in how the world came to be, it's going to affect how you interact with everything that's in that world. So yeah.
Yeah, we'll get into this obviously as the talk goes on. I listened to a good conversation though on that Myth Vision podcast with Aaron Ra. He was the guest on one of the shows. He's the prominent YouTube atheist for people who don't know. And the way he was describing his family, it kind of reminds me of like every small town has people like this, and like Ra himself went through various belief systems. I'm trying to think if he was a Christian, but I know at one point he was into like pagan pagan mythology and stuff. Then he became a very committed atheist, and like he went through different phases. And he talks about like, my family, they're very strong people. Like they're the type of people that if you put them in the woods, they'll build a town there. And he said historically that's what happened. But he's like, they're also the type of people that like they won't travel, like they won't go to New York or Miami because it's considered too foreign for them. Their town is the best, their religion is the best, their high school is the best. There's no reason to leave the area. Unfortunately for some of them, our race is the best. There's all that. And I think, and you know, he was debating, he's wondering like, where does this come from? Like, is it just some old tribal instinct that hasn't died out? Is it that people are just in their comfort zones and they don't want to leave them? Like you and I talked about the whole Maslow's hierarchy of needs thing, like maybe in their context, they see all those needs being met. So there's no reason to leave because they see it as, if I leave, I could sacrifice certain things that I value and there's no upside, when they don't see the bigger picture that no, there could be upside if they actually learn other things, go other places, meet other people. I think some people just lack a sense of curiosity about the world. Like he talks about his family, like they won't talk about anything that happened before grandpa was young or something. And it's like, I don't know. I mean, I guess for some people, they just lack that curiosity about the world, or they're just fine sticking with their tribe. Or like I say, I mean, I'm from a small town and I've known people like this. Like I know someone who's probably about 60 something. They didn't even come to the city here until like a few years ago. And it's like, they only grew up an hour and a half away, but like New York was like too foreign or too strange to them. And it's like, but that's the thing. It's like, I think there are a lot of people like this. And again, is it these old instincts that haven't evolved out of people yet? Is it insecurity? I don't know. I've wondered this in my own mind because I've always been sort of the opposite. Like I like meeting different people. I like trying different things. I like seeing other areas. So like that mentality I just described, it's always been kind of foreign to me, I think.
Yeah, that is something I've tried to relate to. Just think about the people who grew up in one place, and that's just, well, they know, because for me, it's just before I even realized what was happening. I was in different continents and trying to relearn languages and appearances of people, locations, climate, everything. So those things were changing, and I realized it's rather exceptional to how history used to be. Like we've actually lived and developed in certain areas, yet I think as we get to this point, we will start seeing that since we still are the human animal, we still are all here on Earth, we still are on here in a pale blue dot that's in this universe, still being subject to the same kind of physics, the same kind of gravity, through the same kind of evolved organic robot machine that we have. We're going to notice that we've come to certain observations just from existing. So what actually leads to these things? I think another definition I put down is for God, because that's another thing. With these certain belief systems, like God isn't as simple as God. It's not as simple as that. When you say God to most people who I think are listening to this in default, you're living in a place, people just talk about God, and by default they mean the Christian God. Now, the Christian God, even the name the Christian God, does he have a name? I think in general they say the Jehovah thing, but it's been found out that that's actually something that comes from a mistranslation of the spaces between the Jewish letters for Yahweh or something like that. So I don't know if there's actually a biblical name for the different things people would actually refer to, but in general, they've gotten to the point where they just say God is that. But for most of the time when gods have existed, I guess from before the time, you only knew people where you could just say God, but God used to have an actual name. It was like Zeus to some people, but everyone who knew them was just that. Then it got to a point where you'd have to say the specific name because people realize that we have our God, but you have your God, and so you were specific with it. But now we're getting to a point where most people in the West would say God, and they just default to their God. Like even Allah. Allah doesn't mean it's not like a name. It's not like Silas or Stephen. It's just God in Arabic. So we'll get to the point. I think we're getting closer to the thing where I think, and we're also at the point where people can kind of. Before I came out, my background was I was raised Christian, non-denominational. I did go to some Catholic schools, but it was just non-denominational Christian. And when I was coming out to that, to get to a point where I was like more spiritual, and it's like, okay, all these people are talking about the same kind of spirit, the same kind of God, just the same way we have different words for glass or bottle for computer in different languages. People have different gods. But then I started studying them, and I realized no, that's not really the case, because there's many of them that really, if this God is true, these other ones can't be. Like this thing Christopher Hitchens says there's three things. Either he's like either like one of them could be right, and he said either one of them could be right. And he said, no, I get the thing with, I might try to get the thing that Chris, I forget what the thing said. So none of them, there's a situation where they could all be wrong, where one of them could be right. And then they could be a God and we could all be wrong. Then one of them could be right about the God that actually exists, and then all of them could be wrong. But there's no situation where everybody can be right, because there's certain things, certain claims made about gods that completely go against the other claims made about God. So it's like they could either be a god or gods, and none of us are right about the nature of that god or gods. One of the thousands of religions that we've come up with that have been known to man, could actually have it right, or none of them could have it right because there is no god or gods. So I think those are the kind of three states to kind of that existence that could exist. Now, I think it would be good to get into why did it even come to be? And do they go into that? Can you read maybe the chapter listing? Because I haven't read the book at all. And I'm just interested, do they even go into like how we began starting thinking about this? Why do we think about it? Why does
that's a huge part of what the book's about.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, I think it's as good as time as any if you have nothing else to say with the preamble.
A lot of other things I'll probably just interject. So so there's 10 chapters in total. It's very interesting the way the chapters are worded, because what he did was he started with something from the Bible, then he followed it up with a quote from Darwin. So chapter 1 is, in the beginning was the Word, our propensity to believe. Number 2, in the image and likeness. Let's see here. Number 3, our daily bread, craving a caretaker. Number 4, all that is seen and unseen, conceiving souls. Number 5, because the Bible tells me so, believing in the invisible. Let's see here. Where is it here? 6, and deliver us from evil, anthropomorphizing God. Number 7, Yeah, these later chapters get longer. Thy will be done, submitting to the law of God, or parentheses, ask gods. Let's see here. All right, so where is it here? Oh yeah, number 8. Um, wherever two or more of you are gathered, harnessing brain chemistry through ritual. Yeah, that it's actually very interesting. To add on to your earlier point, it's evolutionary psychology and anthropology, but it's also neuroscience. Like he actually gets into the brain, the different functions and brain chemicals and things.
I think that's a play on the line from the Bible where it says like wherever two of you are, I'm there, so you can pray anywhere and things like that. And I think I was also thinking that a bit with when you had mentioned Aaron Ra with his people in the town. It used to be a situation, and if you actually go and you talk to those people there living there, their definition of God, even though they say it's a Christian God, will probably be very different from the people who don't want to live my ancestral village where my parents are growing up, because they have their Christian God there that focuses on that town. Yet Aaron Ra's parents and family would probably think their particular God focuses on that town. But there's this need that people seem to think it has to be the same one. It's like, no, it's these separate ones. And to me, that's kind of cool, like to think about these separate people with these belief systems. That,
So
I guess a few more.
2 more chapters. Okay, so it's O ye of little faith, discovering the physical evidence of God, parentheses S, as byproduct. And then finally, chapter 10 is lest ye be judged, educating our minds.
So, cool. And yeah, with this, I think we'll just go, like Stephen has taken some notes from different chapters, and some of the chapters are shorter or longer.
Yeah.
I think we'll just be recording these as we go, and then I'm still deciding how we'll actually release them, but probably for at least these first couple of ones, will be a few chapters together due to the nature of the notes that he's taken on them. And there will be links below to the book if you want to get it for yourself and read through it, because we'll be discussing some of the things into it, but it won't be a full-on reading of all the content.
Yeah. Yeah, the first chapters, like I say, are pretty short, so we'll kind of breeze through those. But as we get later on, it's going to get more in depth with psychology and brain science and stuff. So, all right, so I'll jump right in. In the beginning was the word, our propensity to believe. In the quotes, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent. It is the one most adaptable to change. Of course, Darwin. Every chapter beginning is followed with a quote from Darwin. Why is religion universal to the human species? Psychology and cognitive neuroscience are shedding the light on this. It's becoming clearer by studies on human behavior and even the brain itself that we evolved to generate certain religious beliefs and became prone to accepting them. Darwin's natural selection plays into this. Survival of the fittest is often misunderstood. It's not about general fitness, but adaptation to environments. So Darwin, combined with Watson and Crick's mapping of the double helix model of DNA, has created the modern Darwinian synthesis. The brain itself has evolved in such a manner as well, each of its own sections in different ways. So the author says here in quotes, religious beliefs are basic human social survival concepts with slight alterations. These adaptations led to the adoption of these religious beliefs, which this book will elaborate on. Let's start with evolution itself. Okay, that's the end of chapter 1. Any thoughts or comments?
There's a key thing here. I'm actually right now I'm re-listening to I think The Moral Animal by Robert Wright. It's one of the earliest books on one of the I think seminal books on The Moral Animal by Robert Wright. Why We Are the Way We Are: The New Science of Evolutionary Psychology. It's one of the first books I read on EvoPsych, and I'm just kind of re-listening to certain things. It's audiobook, and he's also talking about Darwin, so it's a coincidence that we're going with this. And also been listening to some of the things with Christopher Hitchens, some of the debates that he was having and the things that he's talked about. And there's this thing with the whole intelligent design kind of thing where they say, okay, first of all, I think it's a misnomer because some of the things aren't really intelligent, because you actually look at the actual results, like the spandrels that we have, certain things that we have that just don't really work right. The fact that the human baby is born premature because when the human ape was developed, like changing from walking on all fours, and we stood upright, and we had certain benefits from standing upright, but that meant you need to have thinner hips than most other apes, so you could really have a fully grown brain, because our big brains also give us more intellect. So you had to have the kid be born like premature, so he could actually fit through the birth canal. And then since they were premature, that meant they were actually locked down. You had to take a lot of care for them. Most babies, like most apes, they just come out and they can just cling on to the mother and just keep running. You can't do that with a human baby. So that kind of alters and changes things. And then with that time, maybe with that thing of being able to sit down and think and plan on those things, those gave us certain benefits. And when it comes to the actual idea of gods, like the interesting thing for me is like even gods evolved. Like the idea of gods evolved from belief, from faith. Like it's actually even that is part of an evolution. The way we look at existence, how we came to be here, that is an evolving process. And I consider the idea of gods to be just a part of the evolution of sentience, maybe of the sentience of the human ape. So that whole idea, there's this dichotomy that they tried to say where it's like, okay, you either have evolution or creation by a intelligent being. I'm like, no. Like the intelligent being is part of the evolution in my worldview of it, and yeah, I don't know.
Well, to sort of add on to what you're getting at too, there's a few people, a few of them have been on the Myth Vision podcast, but they're very good at explaining about how these ideas evolved over time and how religions took ideas from other religions. Like a lot of people act like Christianity is so original. It's like, well, we know it was born out of Judaism, and then Judaism was influenced by Zoroastrianism. Christianity was influenced by some of the Greek stuff. There's debate about were the Greeks influenced by the Egyptians. The Egyptians, I haven't checked it out, but I guess there's a book about how much came from Sumeria originally, how much the Egyptians and others took from that. So you keep going back. It's like how many of these beliefs were truly original to these belief systems. And Aaron Ra has talked about this as well. Like if you watch certain movies, you'll see certain tropes that keep recurring. Like there were articles about Cloverfield and Independence Day, and they said how with Independence Day, the only thing that was original was how big the ships were on the screen. That was the only thing. Everything else was sort of copied from other movies. But that's what happens. People assimilate ideas from other things and they tie it into their own stories and make it something else. So like it's very hard to find original ideas. Another example that's come up was the Sargon of Akkad story versus Moses. Like I guess both had sort of the slaughtering of the innocents. They both got the laws engraved on a stone tablet. With Moses, it was lightning struck a mountain and it was carved into that. Sargon, somehow, I guess the fire burned into the tablets on the ground or something. But you notice these themes keep coming up. And of course, there's stuff about Jesus with Dionysus turning water into wine, dying and rising gods. Like you can find all sorts of stuff. But the idea is that like a lot of these ideas, where did they come from originally? It's very hard to say. But did people have likely assimilated these ideas and then said, oh yeah, we came up with this? When in reality, no, they just saw that certain ideas were better and they adopted them accordingly.
Yeah, and we're storytelling machines. I think we tell stories about things, and that goes from the genetic level. The genes are telling a story. They're writing, they're literally writing themselves over and over again into existence, and they just use recreating stuff. Okay, this is a story about who I am. This is a story about how you build this, how you put this together. And I think there's a lot of post facto rationalization for things rather than those things coming to the actual forefront. And when you look at the actual religion, you talk about the Sumerians. I think the Sumerians was the earliest one, like the Gilgamesh story. And I'm focusing more on like actual storytelling. I think we need a new way to tell stories because I think the knowledge, the awareness that we have, the amount of data we can take in has surpassed the structures of stories that we're telling. Because I think the current storytelling we're telling with the hero's journey type of thing, that started with like the story of Gilgamesh, which is from Sumerians, and they say, okay, that's the oldest religion, but that's the oldest known religion.
Yeah.
There were religions before that. There were religions that came up and disappeared because the people who believed it just died off. They didn't write it down. This is pre-literal. Is it pre-literal? Is that the
prehistorical? You mean prehistorical? Because history is history is considered marked with when things were recorded. That's how we know about it. Whereas everything else we just infer from fossils and other things.
Is it pre-literate? Is that the thing? Pre-literate when you're illiterate, so you can't read or write, and then so you're not actually putting down any of the actual information. So even with like the oral stories, it's not like the Sumerians all of a sudden people were just living without any beliefs in gods, and then all of a sudden they're like, now that we can write, let's just come up with a story about Gilgamesh. It's like, no. There was thousands of years where people were telling stories in the oral tradition, and then they were finding like, hey, let's actually collect these things together because we have enough actual extra time to actually have the ability to actually take and see some importance from this. And from that, we've had this explosion. And that was one of the lines. There's lines coming out of different countries and different places, different locations that come to tell the current landscape of all these gods that we have in this belief systems. I think it's a very enriching thing. And to me, it was a promising thing. I know when I still had that feeling in me that I had to believe, otherwise I'm going to go to hell, or it's going to be this horrific type of thing, or I'm lesser because I'm not actually I can't actually, I can't believe this. Like, I don't believe this stuff. So it was like, okay, maybe if I believe this other thing, maybe if I just had this other faith. And you see that in the people of faith, they would rather, some of them would rather accept somebody who believed a God that was completely antithetical to theirs than countenance somebody who just says, no, I don't have any belief in any gods. It's tougher for people. You know, people would say, instead of, okay, I get you're not Christian, but maybe you're a Muslim. I get you're not Muslim, but maybe you're a Zoroastrian. Like, it's like, people don't normally go as far back like Sumerians and things like that. But there was a time I used to troll people. I was like, whenever people would talk about religions, it was like, yeah, you stole all this. And I was starting to learn more about the Sumerian religions. And whenever somebody would mention anything about their god, I would just say like, no, you're stealing this from this god from. And it's rather fantastic to me how sort of unchanged it's been from the Sumerians. Like it's a very interesting pantheon of gods. If you really want to look at it, if somebody out here hasn't looked at it and you've heard about it, read the story of Gilgamesh. Read about the Sumerian gods. It's a fantastic type of thing. Like part of my main objection to some of the Abrahamic religions is they're just very boring compared to like the things that we have out there. So coming out of that, I was wondering if I'm lost, if I don't have the story, why don't I? But then I started realizing part of the reason so many people were asking these questions, we had these different things, but they were making similar observations that I was having of reality, but they found different ways to come to terms with those questions that they had, and that to me gave me more of it reinforced the observation that I had that we are just human beings, we're just existences, and we're trying to make sense of this, and seeing the similarities from these people from so many different places who never knew each other, who never even knew these other people existed, were coming up to these kind of similar type of things, that they worked their way through all these questions that we had with such limited information that they had at that time. That to me was actually gave me more strength and feeling of connection than I ever felt from reading any one particular book or being in any one particular environment or church or location. That could be personally due to my childhood and my unique way of looking at things, very artistic, or the kind of things like we discussed. But that's just part of my history on coming to that. And I don't understand why it seems so dismaying to some people to see the similarities, when for me those similarities were part of what made me like, oh wow, that's really awesome that they're actually this similar.
Well, it's also, it relates to the first point, like about Aaron's family. Like some people, I guess, just lack the curiosity. Like they would rather have simple answers laid out for them, and I could just defer to them. It's like, whereas I'm the type, I'm always asking questions and trying to get a better understanding of things. Like, you know, this stuff about, oh, which religions copied from who? Well, who did they copy from, and where did that come from? And then which philosophers talked about these things way before Christianity that they got these things from? And, you know, it's not to say that some of these religions didn't take on good ideas, but these ideas were not unique to those religions. Like Christianity, you know, Christians did not create a whole new moral system completely out of the blue. They were drawing on other people, which, again, you know, you and I have talked several times. Appropriation is a good thing. I mean, that's how people progress. But you can't act like we somehow came up with this entirely on our own. And if you criticize our belief system, you're advocating throwing out all these ideas when it's like other people were saying the same things long before you. Oh,
Yeah.
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 All right. So, chapter 2. Let's see here. In the image and likeness, Darwin says, to kill an error is as good a service as, and sometimes even better than, the establishing of a new truth or fact. We don't, quote unquote, descend from apes. We literally are apes. We share 98.6% of the same DNA. Now, he walks through the various stages of evolution. I'm not going to get into it here. I think most of the people watching this understand roughly how evolution works. If you want to look it up, you can, but I don't feel the need to cite it all here. Homo erectus, Cro-Magnon, Neanderthals, which split off, mixed into a degree, mostly died out, et cetera, et cetera. It's believed that the first Homo sapiens with the ability for language left Africa about 60,000 years ago. So what enabled the Homo sapiens to survive while others died off? In short, our ability to work in groups and socialize, which led to an enlarged frontal lobe in the brain. So the groupishness is still true today, not just in terms of countries, religions, etc., but they've done studies, for example, showing that if you divide people into groups, people will identify as members of those groups and see the opponents as the out group. So you see this with sports teams. They've done this with little team exercises, things like that. So this is not ancient history. As recently as 500 years ago, 2/3 of the world lived in hunter-gatherer tribes. So we're still very tribal in our psychology. What does this have to do with religion? Everything. And the author says, Religion utilizes and piggybacks on everyday social thought processes, adaptive psychological mechanisms that evolve to help us negotiate our relationships with other people, to detect agency and intent, and to generate a sense of safety. This is why we survived. So religion is not an adaptation in of itself, but rather a byproduct of these adaptations, hence why it is so powerful. So the comparison he makes here is, think of religion being, again, it's not an adaptation itself, it's rather the result of previous adaptations, and certain things get hijacked in order to get people to believe in the religions. A comparison to this could be, why do we crave fast food? Well, because our ancestors needed sugar and fat because those were sources of energy. That's why bright colors are appealing, because it meant ripe fruit. That sugar was appealing because it was a source of energy. Fat, which we got from game, was appealing, again, source of energy. But the thing is, it was harder for our ancestors to get those, hence the dopamine hit we got for getting those, because it's basically the brain sending a signal saying, like, thanks for giving me this, try and get more of it. But in our ancestors' environments, sugar and fat were much harder to come by. Plus, there were also limiting factors, because if you think about it, you can eat a sweet fruit, but you're going to get full from the fiber. You can eat fat from game meat, but the protein is going to fill you up. So there's sort of that restraining factor to prevent you from eating too much of it. But because our ancestors perceived that in their environments, those things were very short, those cravings are practically open-ended. That's why if you drink a bunch of soda, you'll crave more sugar, because it's that feedback loop of, okay, I'm getting the dopamine hit. He calls it the do it again center of the brain, which says, oh, well, get more of this. You see fries, they taste good. Oh, these were really good. Oh, I'm going to have some more. So that's why we overeat. But again, that adaptation made sense from a survival standpoint and in our ancestors' environments, but it can get hijacked in the present day because those things we crave are in far more abundance than needed. I touched in a few previous videos about pornography. It has a similar mechanism. Video games, same thing, because pornography, the brain thinks, oh, I'm getting sex. Video games thinks you're accomplishing something you're really not, but it hijacks that whole feedback loop system, which gets you to keep doing it. But in reality, of course, you're not physically doing anything, but the brain still thinks you are, so it gives that feedback reward mechanism, if that makes sense. Did you have any thoughts or comments on that before I jump to the next thing?
Definitely want to reiterate the aspect of we are all animals. That's one thing that it's one of the few things I think normally somebody mentioned things with like hitting kids, like peaceful parenting. If I see a chance to mention something about that, I try to make time to do it. Another one I dislike is that separation where people try to say, okay, humans are different, it's a select group, and then there's animals. Like, no, humans are part of animal. We are apes. We're thinking apes. To me, we're the most important earthlings. I prefer human earthlings over any other earthlings, but we are part of nature. We are animals. So that was one thing. And again, just with a repeat to the tribal religions thing, for most of existence, it was the tribe was the largest group. Not even is tribe. Yeah, tribe is bigger than clan.
Yeah, because a clan is just more like family and maybe extended family. A tribe is supposed to be like other families too. So
for most of human society, the tribe has been the largest entity that people could identify with, and I think, even though we've expanded to this global, I think globalization is already here for at least a significant. It would take to be some massive solar flare, EMP, or those aliens we were talking about at the start coming in, like wiping out the entire infosphere of the Earth to get us to not to return to a pre-globalized. With people like Elon Musk, we're actually getting to the point where we're going to be Solarians, we're going to be multi-planetary species. But anyway, so most of us still operate on the tribe thing. Our genetics are selected to operate on a tribal thing. It doesn't mean the things they've selected for cannot work on a larger than tribal level, but I think religions were the storytelling, were the mechanism, were the information organism that were established in order to keep the organism of a tribe together. The communication system with it. You don't need a personal religion to have your thoughts, to tell your arm to move here, to react to this thing. But a tribe, which is a more larger organism of shared genes moving around, the religion is the idea, it's the brain. It's how, like, okay, I need this part of the tribe to move here because all of us have this shared belief that if we don't do this, our existence as a being has been organized in order to do this kind of thing. So we're going to move this way. So it's kind of, in religions, there's a separate thing. Religion, and this is another thing I put down for definition, put the religion between Right now we're faith, belief, God, religion, and theology, because I want to make sure that people understand there's a difference between something that's a religion and something that's a theology. Christianity is a theology because it has a God and a system like that. It's also a religion. Buddhism is a religion, but it's not a theology because there's no actual God in Buddhism. There's
Yeah.
nirvana and all those kind of things, but Buddha is not a God. So there's a difference with this thing. Statism, regressivism, postmodernism, those kind of things we've discussed in separate videos. We do think those are rather religious. Like they're getting into the structures where they have the different systems, the evil people, the good, the bad, the things you believe and faith, the certain appearances, certain ways you worship, that kind of thing. They're those kind of things that are signified. And I think things like science, mathematics, economics, diets, other cultural aspects used to be just the academic aspect of it, the writing, the thought of those things that actually drove culture used to be just tied together in a religious sense, where it was something you had the faith belief because you didn't have the ability and the scholarship and the time and the technology to actually go in and find and collect enough information and data to have these things where you can say it's an academic scholastic thing backed by empirical evidence. The whole idea of an expectation of actual empirical evidence for all these other things that we are aware of, there was a lot more known unknowns. We knew rain occurred, but we did not have the ability to understand why rain occurred. So religion came in and was able to have us make sense and account for that without having to teach every single kid, like, yeah, this huge horrific thing called rain happened, but we have no idea why it happens. You'd have so many people spending so much time just completely panicked about all these things we didn't know. So it was a lot better to say, like, we realize we're aware of this, but we've looked at it enough where it's not productive for our tribe, it's not productive for our tribe, any part of our tribe to spend too much time focusing on why the rain exists. It exists. You only need to know, be aware of it. But instead of worrying about that, understand that our gods got that. They got that in check. Or the shaman, he's got that in check. It's aware. We got that. You go along and make sure you find the spouse. Make sure you reproduce. Make sure you keep us safe from the actual lions and things like that. And go along. It's something that has a purpose. It's part of why it's there. But for me, my main question is it something that we need to be as strong as it is? What's the actual main purpose of just religious, like treating things in a religious sense, and specifically, what is the main purpose currently today, in terms of human flourishing going into the future, of having faith and belief in gods to the level that we've had it, that some people are advocating for, and to me, I seem to want it a lot less than a lot of people that I've seen, who I agree with on a lot of other more practical, significant things, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, sure. All right, so I just had a few more points in this last chapter. Something else I was going to say on my own. Let me see here. So we'll get more into it as it goes later, but like, for example, think of these adaptations as like sort of like reading and writing. Like there's no part in our brain that is like the reading or writing part. What it is that we developed visual skills, visual spatial awareness, communication skills, then motor skills, and then it was figured out at one point, well, what's a better way to communicate, what's a better way to write down information. Those things combined in order to produce reading and writing. Then eventually that became sending messages, eventually of course letters, and then email, etc., etc. And the author talks in one of his interviews about codependency versus interdependency, because he was saying how the host of the Myth Vision podcast said to him, he's like, oh, this is where codependency comes from, and that's why it's unhealthy. And he makes the point that don't look at it that way. Look at it as a lot of these adaptations happen for a reason. Maybe in the past, a woman was codependent because all she had was her tribe and the guy protecting her. So she was willing to put up with all sorts of things because she saw it as no way out. So it's in the present day, it's dysfunctional because she can go somewhere else, but looking at it in that context, it makes sense. Same thing with like the fast food cravings. Like, you know, people will look at that today and say, wow, I wish I craved healthy food instead of this. But if you look at how and why we evolved, it makes sense in that context. So it's the same thing with religious adaptations more generally. These evolved for realistic, practical reasons, but they can also take us down a bad path and destroy us. And there's a guy, Richard Carrier. He's pretty controversial. I know some people don't like him. He seems to be one of those people love or hate. He takes one of those mythicist views of Jesus. Like he's one of those who thinks he didn't exist except like purely as a mythical figure. And he says, I think he said, he's like, I give him a 1 in 3 chance of existing as a historical figure. And he wrote some good books about science in the Roman Empire, and it's really interesting because I've sort of read parts of them. I want to sit down and read them both all the way through, but the first one has to do with science education in the Roman Empire and like what did the Romans consider science, who was educated, all this. And then in the second one, it's about how far did Roman science actually progress. And one of the points he makes is that in order for science to progress, a culture, broadly speaking, has to value three things: curiosity, a desire to understand the world; empiricism, that's evidence trumps whatever, that trumps authority, that trumps scripture, all that; and three, a desire for progress and change, even at the expense of older ideas. And to be fair, the ancient pagans, and pagan itself is a very broad group, they were not perfect on these things. I mean, remember, Socrates was killed for not worshiping the gods of the city and all that. But if you look at what went on in ancient Roman Greece, there were more robust, rigorous debates about is the sun the center of the universe, or is the earth? Is the earth round, or is it flat? There was even an early germ theory of disease. You had the Dr. Galen, who was dissecting animals and figuring out, okay, you put this much water into the animal, this much comes out. Well, it goes through the kidneys. Like, they were starting to understand some of those things. And he makes the point that if you look at the early church fathers, you look at St. Paul, all this, they say things about like, oh, we don't have to understand science. If God wanted us to know these things, they'd be in scripture. He'd help us understand things like this. And the criticism, which, some people have tried to say Christianity is friendlier towards science. My view is it's kind of like the socialists. They fought these ideas when they were in practice. And once they saw the benefits, they tried to take credit after the fact. They jumped in and tried to say, oh, thanks to our belief system, we have all these ideas, when it was really older ideas being resurrected and built and expanded upon, and they just jumped in and took credit for it. And it's the same thing, like I say, with the socialists. And he's very good, too, about breaking up, like how, the ancients, of course, as far as science education, it was a very small percentage of the population. A lot of Greeks and Romans were illiterate, quite frankly, and to know medicine and things, you had to learn Greek, which only, of course, the elites did. So I think he broke it down, and they figured out that, like, it was like 0.075% or something of the Roman population was well educated in science. So when you think about it, that's why there was that. But that's why there was, that may not be an exact number, but it's somewhere around there. But his point is, you have to think about it. There was no printing press yet. There were no chalkboards. Paper was hard to come by. It wasn't easy to get information around. So even if you have all these smart people working hard, you're only going to get so far. Whereas later on, okay, the printing press and other things. And he's good about explaining how Galileo and Newton, they were superstitious in their own ways, and they had some bad scientific methods too, but they did have some good things, and that's what produced the actual changes, which built the scientific revolution and then agriculture, industrial revolutions, and so on. But he's very good about breaking down this history and also the values, like what values led to these ideas being embraced and what values prevented them. That's kind of a long-winded rant. Again, that could probably be a whole series in of itself, but these underlying values are important to understand, because this, I would say, these are the building blocks for why a civilization progresses versus stagnates or declines.
Yeah, you'll find a lot of agreement with me on that. Is often people want to say, oh, this happened due to Christianity, or the Christians did this. Like, as I was saying in the Moral Animal book, somebody was talking about this situation with just the morality of the relationships. And to me, one of the key things to just understand humanity is we're gene reproducing machines.
Yeah.
The genes are kind of telling stories to each other in order to reproduce themselves. So if you take out reproduction, doesn't mean every single organism is about reproduction. But if you look at an anthill, for example, and you see this the soldier ant that just goes around, he said it's actually ants that are technically just doors. They're just doormen. They're just born to just be a doorman, to sit there and just make sure every ant that comes in has the right pheromones in order to enter that place or to slice it. And that's its entire life thing. Once it's born, it just heads right there and it does that. There's others that are just supposed to just gorge themselves and just be stores. Instead of having a store where you have a pantry, the animal becomes a pantry where if there's a shortage of food and the queen or the few females need it, that ant just sacrifices itself. That's its purpose.
Yeah.
If you look at just that, it seems weird. But then if you understand that the entire ant organism is this genetic thing pushing this thing to reproduce the entire genes of those ants, it makes sense. So you look at human society, as you said, we are animals, so some things are actually in there. So there were some things with reproduction going in, and then there was a certain scholar, I forget, I actually wrote her name down. I went to get her actual name out here because she deserves the appropriate scorn needs to be showered on this individual, because we were talking about how 0.05% was well educated.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, Isn't that kind of where we are still?
Well, it's funny you said that because Carrier himself actually said that how like the elites were embracing science and progress and the average Roman peasant was not. So he's like, so not much has changed. And it's like,
Yeah.
but that's how it is. But then the argument could be made that today it's easier for a higher percentage to be educated because you have, obviously not just, I mean, we have our criticisms of public schools, but on average, people have more access to way more information. It's a lot easier to find things out on your own. It would be easier for the average person to conduct scientific research, get into a university and do these things. So it's easier for science to progress in that sense. Whereas, like, I think the argument could be made that with the Romans, that if they had all that technology, they could have had more scientific output, but it would not, it would be like, as we often say, it would be a bell curve thing. Like it wouldn't be the average Roman or Greek would be this rational scientist type. You'd probably have a tiny handful of exceptional scientists, some like mediocre scientists, then other people who have some familiarity but aren't really doing much. Like it would probably be more like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like religion was a story. It was a way of storytelling. And at that point, the human animal, like it's why apes, it's why chimps don't have religions, because they don't really have the cognitive ability to actually make a religion and have any purpose for their genes. Even if you could teach one chimp some kind of faith and belief in God, it doesn't benefit that chimp to reproduce, to teach any other chimps that faith in that God. So that won't actually be selected for it. So the floor has raised with literacy increasing. That's definitely is something that has changed. The amount of people with literacy, that has changed. But to say well-educated, that again is now something comparative. Being well-educated in Roman times is different than being well-educated now. Like I'm not well-educated in 99.9999999% of the things that you could possibly be educated about. But back then, you could probably only be well-educated about 1,000 things. So I think that kind of thing is always going to constantly change. But this person was named Mead. She went to the Samoan Islands, and she said there was a difference, because people were talking about how most societies have the difference between the way promiscuity in males versus females, how it's treated in that sense. And she went and said, oh, the Samoans, he said, it's different with the Samoans. Like the females are just promiscuous and nobody really cares. It's not really a thing that's touched, that's talked about. And then somebody, she came back with that to the West, and that was being thrown in with the literature while people were trying to understand Evo Psych and all these things in relationships. And they kept saying, what about Samoa? What about Samoa? And then somebody decided to actually study and look into what she had actually done. And that same falsifiability thing that we talked about, how it says like you can't actually repeat the studies of like 90% of certain fields. Like
replication crisis, they call it.
Yeah. So she actually went to Samoa for 6 months. She didn't even live among the Samoans. She didn't even learn the language.
Yeah.
So it turns out there was a few girls she was interviewing that were just playing games with her and just completely lying to her. And the person who actually ended up studying that decided to move there for 6 years, learned the languages, living among the people, and started learning the different customs that we're having in there. And then they went to a point where it's like, oh, there was a point where if there was normally one virginal female that was normally the chiefs of the chief's family and things like that. And then they would normally check in general to see if a woman was going to be a virgin at the time of her marriage, and if the person wasn't a virgin, the parents of the girl's family used to go and do a vigil in front of the male's family and family's home and just like apologize. And there was some times before the colonialists that got there where there was times when the family would go out and beat those people up and they would kill them. At least when the virginal female of the high-ranking family in the tribe, who was supposed to be of every generation, there was one, until she reaches her point of fertility and was given off to a high value, a high worth, high status male. Then they would test her virginity, and they used to test this out in public, and they did this thing with the missionaries coming, say at least test it behind sheets. But they used to test it in public. If she was found not to be a virgin, they would just stone her to death. They would just fall upon her and with stones and kill her there. So the person's like, well, the Christians got there, and with the Christians, they taught them to stop the stoning. I was like, is that really a Christian thing? Because remember the whole thing, like if somebody's a virgin, you stone her outside of the gates. Like that was also in there. It's like, no, it's humanity used to have certain ways of guarding certain things and developing certain things and telling certain stories that changes. And when you come to the whole idea with the Christianity and thing, one more thing on the Christianity, as you said, with 1 in 3, if Jesus existed, I often hear people say, "Oh, well, historians completely agree that he exists." I'm like, even if they agree that he existed, saying somebody named Jesus that these stories were based on existed does not mean you're also acquiescing to the resurrection, to the angels, to the spending 40 days and 40 nights in the desert. Like, no, you're saying a human being existed that these stories were based on. That's okay, but I'm not saying like any of the magical stuff is also in that just because a historian says that there's actually evidence that somebody named of this kind of person has actually lived there. But yeah.
Well, it's funny you should mention that about Mead. I think Wilfred Riley brought her up because he talks about like how a lot of leftists act like if minorities ran everything, life would just be like one big party all the time. And like I think he mentioned, I think this was the woman he was mentioning, where it's like, you know, they go to some island like on vacation or something, and they're like, oh, everyone's partying, it's fun, that's what life is like. And then people from those islands, like the Filipinos that I know are some of the hardest working people. So yeah, you may go on vacation there, hang out, but it's like that's not what they do all the time. And then if you ask them about it, they'll even say like, no, yeah, we go to a resort and hang out, but it's like average day, we're going to work, waking up early. You know, Nigerians and Ghanaians, I'm pretty sure, you know, they out earn white people. I'm pretty sure they're waking up early, working hard. So it's like it's a big misconception of what life is actually like in those countries. It's like you went there for a bit and went on vacation and you thought somehow that was normal or something. And then the other point I was going to add to your earlier point, Jonathan Haidt says in The Righteous Mind how man is 90% chimp, 10% ant, and I think that's a good observation. Well, because he's talking about how we are selfish like chimps. I mean, we did evolve for self-interest and all that, but we're not as selfish as them. And at the same time, we do cooperate to a point, because obviously, as I mentioned before, if we hadn't cooperated, we would have just died out. Like there would have been no way all these individual people could have survived on their own. But chimps, of course, do cooperate to a degree as well. I mean, they're not completely isolationist either. Certain animals maybe, like they're not primates, obviously, but like tigers. But I mean, a tiger is such a powerful, strong animal; it's fine on its own. Whereas a lot of these other animals, they like, including our ancestors, they could have easily gotten picked off by wildlife. So working together was a necessity.
Yeah, and this could be also this be something to do with the numbers, because I think with insects, especially when you look at something like ants, they are one of the few actual insects that we can see. Okay, this many of the same kind of species are living in a relatively single location, and this is how they overcome the because it's just the same interest. When you say eventually you see, okay, this person is my family, so you have some benefits, your genes in that sense. Then your genes get to a point where they see some genetic connection between the clan, then some genetic connection between the tribe, some genetic connection between the region, the genetic connection to the nation, and things like that. And you're seeing some problematic things like that coming up with the cultural diversity and things like that, without having some kind of central story idea that used to hold together larger groups of people. But anyway, so coming back to that, so I think societal structure-wise, I think most definitely ants are the closest in the other greater animal kingdom to the way human societies exist. And maybe that's just something where eventually, when enough of an organism is together and has some kind of awareness and tactile ability to interact with its culture, it's going to do certain things. And with the ants going into that thing, that's why I'm thinking like so it's like people say, oh, well, we need to have, how come, and MGTOW's coming around saying there's not enough good women, the women are saying there's not enough good women. I think in general, it's like this whole idea that everyone reproduces is such a novel thing to humans. We're like, even for most human history, we understood most human beings would not reproduce.
Yeah.
When it comes to the rest of the life forms, most life forms don't actually reproduce. Like it's uncommon. It's less common that life actually exists. And I think that even goes in, I wonder if it ties into the universal level. That's
well, I was going to say too, Haidt mentions in the book as well that I guess they believe that there were more individualistic insects, but they got picked off. So that because they found all these little samples in amber and fossils and other things, but then they figured out at some point termites and ants may have been more solitary creatures, but at some point it's like, well, wait a minute, if we all work together, we're much stronger together. So somehow they evolved to do that. But it's like the insects that didn't do that, they just got wiped out. So that's why, like, you think of like with hornets or something, like if you attack the nest, they all swarm because they're defending their home. But it's like one hornet stinging an animal isn't much, but if they all gang up on that animal, that could be a serious problem. So there's things like that.
Oh, hear that?
Yeah, I heard that.
That was a close one. With this, I was thinking, as you mentioned also below, there's something with selecting for religion. Like we are selected to, since it's been something that, whether you like it or not, it's like a simple thing like we are selected for language. Our earliest humans were not able to have the ability to speak like we do.
Yeah.
So over some time, it was just selected that whichever species, whichever kids had the ability to vocalize things in a more effective way would gain enough resources in order to pass their genes on in a certain way to have some kind of up on the people who did. So eventually we figured out better way to have vocal cords selecting for that. Religion itself was a way that was developed in order to pass on certain ideas. So a deference and the fear and awareness and the belief in the God that came with religions, which was built um, on the religious way of looking at things, came as well. So I think that was also selected for after some time, and that was based off of certain level of awareness of society, certain suspension of disbelief, in order to make sense of things that you did not know, just like we're talking about with the Roman times when back then there was stuff we did not know about certain things. So people were less aware, less educated about even just like the most average, like basic things like rain and things like that. But now that same being that has been selected to have a religious way of approaching the world, most of the things, the questions that existed in the past, that selection for religion had come in, are answered already by actual evidence. So you can't really get to the point where God used to serve a purpose to many known unknowns that are now known knowns. So it's getting to the point where that same selection of being open to religion can't find its outlets in the classical gods. So I think that's why you're seeing it going off in these atheist, like statist, more secular type of belief systems where they're being caught in these actors, and we have to be aware of this. We have to be worried about this. This person is evil. The white devil is just always there. Like this general oppression. Instead of that devil, instead of Satan, there's this white devil out there that's always out there. It's constantly oppressing us because we were selected from being able to be plugged into a society where the people above can tell you there's an eternal good, there's an eternal bad. We always have to be heading towards that eternal good that is this, and away from this eternal bad that is that. And then this is how we're positive. So now we're at the point where we realize those eternals aren't as absolute as they are, and they're constantly changing depending on where you are. Like if you're unplugged from the United States of America being taught about the evil white man, then you find yourself in Africa and there's no white people who fits into that spot of that evil white devil. So there's the kind of situation where I think we're seeing some schisms, some problems in society because we're still selected for a belief in God, but the things that a belief in God was beneficial to answer have already been answered in a more effective way.
Yeah.
So it's not we're unable to actually still believe that, but the ability to believe is still something that's I think somewhat selected for in who we are. In the same way how I think there's people who are more selected to be asexual, selected to be heterosexual, like transgenderism itself, that there's some genetic aspects to those two people's sexuality, but depending on what culture that you live in, you're not going to be able to express and act on it that as much. So I think you're limited by your nature has certain things, but your nurture has different things depending on the thing. So it's kind of like I don't know if those two things. I mean, maybe I shouldn't have brought that in. I don't know if that really works together, but it's the kind of the thing where it's like if something is selected for, if you can behave on it more, there'll be more of that passed on. If it's not as damaging for you to behave that way, to act on it that way. But if something is an ability and it gives you no benefits to actually believe that way, it's not going to be passed on as much, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, because that's one of the theories that's come up regarding, they're trying to figure out, of course, the basis for homosexuality, but there's a theory that a lot of guys were gay, but it's like they would close their eyes and have sex with a woman, so those genes were passed on, even though like they themselves weren't really into it. But then now today they can be open, plus like we discussed previously, in vitro fertilization and other things, they can still pass those genes on. It's just now it's not okay, I'm gonna have sex with a woman to pass my genes on, but back then it was okay, I'm an important figure or head of state or something. I'll get married, I'll, pretend to be attracted or marry for diplomatic reasons, have some male lover on the side, but those genes still get passed on. So there's that dynamic of it too. Whereas other people might have just been killed off because the culture didn't allow it. Yeah.
Yeah, that came up before, I think, and we also, I don't know if we answered it at that time, but also with that situation, now with in vitro fertilization, if they're not passing on their own genes, it's a
Yeah.
situation where, like recently, the situation with Amanda Nunes, and she has a wife, Katrina Nunes. She took Amanda's new name. They both mixed martial artist fighters for the UFC. But I
Right.
think maybe in a previous society, both of them might have still had their lesbian relationships, but they would have married on and passed on their genes. But in this situation, they're both females, so I think they adopted, or no,
Hmm.
or the wife. I think the wife took on the wife got impregnated, I think, artificial insemination. But now in that situation, so I'm kind of wondering, and I think this came up before, if the gay men in the past would say, like, okay, we have the genes for it, we have the genes more heading us with a preference towards it or more predilection towards that kind of sense, then in the past, they would just bite the bullet
Yeah.
and have sex with a female, with the icky female,
Yeah.
even if they were not like attractive. So they'd pass on those genes. Now, if they're deciding we'll have the kid and none of them are saying we're going to actually artificial inseminate another female, or if it's only one of them, and in this sense with Amanda Nunes, it's only one of them, the females in that partnership passing on their genes, are there going to be fewer genes for the tendency to be lesbian or gay? Yeah, it's going to be fewer homosexual genes passed on, even though there's a higher ability for you to actually be homosexual and not have it be negative. It's more accepted in society, but the genes are fewer because not as many of the people who have those genes are deciding to just partner up and pass them on anyway. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's hard to say because there's so many variables there. Like we say, how many are in vitro, how many just won't have kids. Then, like, there's certain parts of the world where there could be people who will go along with it. Like maybe certain people in Islamic countries will have kids even though they secretly favor the other sex. I feel like there's so many variables that could go all sorts of different directions.
Yeah, and it's a pendulum type of thing. Like now it goes to the kind of God situation. Like you live in certain societies and people feel the need to just signal a belief in God. If you go to church in most societies in the West, if you listen to this, there's a higher chance of you actually meeting somebody around your age group to have the reproduction. But then maybe you look at the people who are atheists. So if there is also a genetic aspect, and I do think there is a genetic aspect to the people who are able to actually have a lower level of questions in order to believe a certain proposition when it comes to the whole God proposition, or be people who are just willing to at least just say, like in the past, people were like, okay, if I say I'm not an atheist, I'm not going to be able to have a job. Like in order to be religious, part of being religious was coming together and having kids. I heard some woman call into a show and she's like, oh, I met my husband, we're religious, so we believe this kind of way, but I don't want kids. But I remember, I think in my living memory, it was a time where it was like the God was like, come together and reproduce and be bountiful. Like that was also, you'll find other Christians who say, I'm having kids because I'm Christian. Yet somebody will be like, I'm Christian and I'm not having kids. And so they'll have those different beliefs of it. But okay, in the past, if you have a predilection to be atheist, you have the genetic aspect of it, you just say, okay, I'm going to pretend to be religious and believe and pass on my genes with my atheist genes to my kids. But now you're like, I'm an atheist and I'm also dropping that whole religious kind of tie-in of partnering together with somebody in order to pass on the good word and have the many kids. You'll have the fewer kids. So maybe even in that situation, the belief system in it, but I think the belief system relies on too much more things outside of just the genetic aspect where, and maybe this will come up as we continue, and we should get back to it. Maybe we'll come up to continue because I'm making the contention that I don't even think there is anything genetic that belief in God is something that's in us. That's something that humans created and selected for and was added in. It's a social construct because most life forms don't have that. Most of humanity has existed without beliefs in gods. Yet, for people who do believe in God, that belief comes with a thing where there is no humanity without the God. So for them, it's harder for some of them to imagine humanity existing without a belief in God because they believe God created everything. But even when you come to Christianity, people will admit that God created. Will they actually? Hmm.
Which Will
if
they admit
Christianity has
what?
the Adam and Eve thing, will they admit that God created humans? At least the ones who accept evolution with humanity being around the Earth.
I mean, that's a whole conversation in of itself. But like, I've heard different things on that. Like, there are people who take the Genesis story literally. R and Ra has debated people on this. There's people who say that, oh, it's metaphor. There's people who say evolution is real, but it's a byproduct of intelligent design. There are people who say that evolution is just a theory. It hasn't been proven. Like, they deal with it in different ways. I guess it depends on which people you're talking about.
Yeah.
So.
Well, okay, so it depends on, and some religions, some theology, some people who believe in God do believe that the God created humans and humans existed, and then God revealed himself to humans rather relatively later. So they do accept that there was a time when humans, as humans, existed without knowledge of or any gods. But to me, that's something that I completely accept and I'm aware of and can countenance in my mind. But for some people, it's hard to imagine. So it's so much harder for them to imagine God existing after. But I think, as we mentioned with the whole belief system and my saying my mom is the most beautiful person, and then how it goes to the actual actions, from my estimation of what people claim a belief in God entails, from their actions, I would say most people who say that don't seem to act like they believe that.
Yeah.
And I hope something that is touched on a bit in this.
Yeah, it will be actually. All right,
Okay.
so I can just go into chapter 3 then. Our daily bread, craving a caretaker. Darwin says, we must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man with all his noble qualities still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. So many may not realize this, but running in our brains are a variety of mental capacities waiting to be deployed for adaptation, particularly in the social world. These are the building blocks of religion. So we're going to talk about something here called the attachment system. There's a few different terms here that I underlined and wrote in bold just so because they're key terms. All right. So think of that song, We All Need Someone to Lean On. When most of us are in trouble, we turn to a caretaker. This starts from the time when we leave the womb, possibly sooner. The attachment system is so strong that a portion of the brain is dedicated to it. In the case of a baby being attached to its mother, this happens via oxytocin, which we'll get to in a bit. As we get older, this takes place in our romantic relationships. This is believed why we keep ties between adults after the initial romance has faded. We see this, of course, in close friendships, group memberships, etc., etc. So there was a Homo erectus woman found in Africa. They say, based on the fossils, she was believed to have died from hemorrhaging caused by too much vitamin A, possibly eating too much liver. Now, with this, based on what they found, they think this happened over the course of weeks or months, and that if this was the case, she likely survived because of some people taking care of her. And they make the point that, especially in that environment, she only would have survived with a caretaker. If she was wounded, if she was hemorrhaging, wild animals, she would not have lived on her own. So this shows one of our ancestors, the Homo erectus, they still cooperated together and they were willing to help those who were less fortunate because they wanted to keep them alive. They didn't just discard that person and leave them to the wild. So the attachment system shows up today in other things. It's why people get attached to their pets. Children get attached to stuffed animals, or even think of Linus from Charlie Brown with his blanket. That's another case of attachment. So they talk about how he had a patient who was a woman who had an abusive father, and she turned into Christianity, and she said that God was a loving father. So the theory is she was trying to sort of fill that void in herself, the attachment to a father-like figure. And I think I mentioned in a previous video, he says here, there are no atheists in foxholes. What he means by that is that when we're in tough situations, we tend to look to something else and think of different movies they portray this. Like I bring up early on in Saving Private Ryan, you see a bunch of people praying on the beach and stuff because they say that's a hardwired evolutionary instinct. When we're in trouble, we look to something else. If you're surrounded by your comrades who are getting blown away around you, they can't help you. So this feeling of hopelessness, you turn to something else which may not physically be there. And religion itself essentially gives us those supernatural parents to turn to in times of crisis. Okay, any thoughts or comments before I continue?
Yeah, I think there's something that I think is part of why I also do think that the God thing is a lost proposition. It's not something that's coming back. Because I think when the nature of the creation of something ends up being lost in the way it's actually being done, it gets to the point where like, what's the purpose of this anymore? Like we've talked about this with the media, where it's like there was a purpose for the New York Times being created as it is, but part of why it's I think it's a point where it's like beyond actual recovery
Yeah.
is in part because of the situation, why there was an importance to have a newspaper
Yeah.
in New York for the United States of America, taking certain messages and having the clientele, the need, the demographics it was created to serve to grow to the size do not exist anymore. That's not the
Yeah.
world we live anymore. Nobody really demands what the New York Times was established to create. And that's why some of the things it seems to be doing are like, why are they doing this?
Yeah.
Because that's what the animal is. The
Yeah.
animal is the animal. The T-Rex is the T-Rex. The Brontosaurus is the Brontosaurus. Like, it can't be a different animal. It was selected
No.
for something, and then it gets to the point where the dinosaur cannot exist anymore. The environment for the dinosaur to exist can't happen. It can't. The T-Rex can't start grazing on grass. Like, it just can't.
No.
So I think with belief in God, you look at gods, and we needed gods. We needed gods to answer questions that we didn't know. That's why we developed the concepts of gods. And that's how it is in the past. You look at the religions, like, we needed the gods. Like, the gods, we were serving at the gods' pleasure. Like, we were at the mercy of the gods. But you look at the way most people seem to treat, especially the Abrahamic religions, the popular religions right now, it's like the gods need us.
Yeah.
They need us to worship them. They need us to exalt them. They need us to pray to them. They need us to serve them. They need us to do things for them. Whereas in the past, it was more, the gods are doing this.
Yeah.
We're at the mercy of the gods. Oh, the gods did that. The gods are doing, but now it's like we have to do things for the gods. If we don't pray to God, God will feel like, oh, man, like, oh, you gotta pray to me, like I need you. So I think the entire concept of God has been turned around, and we're putting ourselves already in the Godhead, and in part because we've already seen that single humans, or at least groups of humans, can already do things, come together and achieve things beyond the imagination of, beyond anything anyone who has actually created gods can even imagine. And that's what I was thinking, like, some of the more recent gods, like with Mormonism, is very interesting to me at that point, when the scientific method, the change of that complete illiteracy of the
Yeah.
population
Yeah.
in literacy was coming in when the Mormon religion came to be. And I would almost want to do a separate talk where we just talk about that. It's a fantastic
You should
story.
talk with my friend Edward. I think you have him on Facebook. Because remember, he was a Mormon missionary for years.
Yeah.
So it's like you should maybe reach out to him. I think he'd be very interested in doing something about
Yeah,
that.
I posted something on it, and he posted on the status.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll see by getting him in if he wants to talk about that in a separate
Yeah.
one. Edward, if you're listening to this, let us know. It'd be interesting.
He would be the go-to person out of everyone I know to ask about it.
Yeah, and also one of my friends, Jordan Clive, he's actually still in the Mormon religion, but he travels around. We have a lot of this is the thing. There's some people in certain religions. When I'm talking about religion this way, don't think I'm just like saying I damn all religions. I'm not somebody. I'm a religious for sure. Just like I'm a injury. Like, if that's where I'm a broken bones. But I'm not somebody who's going to say breaking your spine is the same as breaking, like, my pinky. Like, I do understand there's a difference between that. If I was told to pick between a broken spine versus a broken pinky, I would pick the broken pinky. So I'm not saying every religion, but I'm also a broken bones. I would rather no broken bones, but that's the kind of thing. I'd rather no religion, or I'm not going to say, like, Christianity today is the same as, like, as it was at the beginning, as it is worship. So I just want to specify that. But what was I talking about? So with the change going over, I haven't looked into Scientology too much, but I'm just thinking about if religions could be invented now. I think if you could talk to a Christian and they were like, okay, could you recreate Christianity today? There's many things they would just not want to say, not want to bring in, but due to the nature of the way some of these things are saying it's an infallible God, there's only so much you can do with, like, taking some of the stuff out and adjusting it. And it's the content is just it's just so not it.
I watched that Leah Remini documentary on Scientology. It's on Netflix, and it's interesting because she and this guy Mike Rinder, like, they were both, like, pretty significant people in it. So they talked about, like, their experiences, and I guess her mother was in it. She got out of it and all this, and it was interesting though because they get into how, remember that Scientology caught on before the internet was big, so there was a lot less information on it. But now there's so much stuff out there that, like, it's very hard to get recruits, because I'm trying to remember, like, they lie about how many people are in it, but it's like if you go to a lot of these buildings, like, there's a few in the city, there's like 5 people in them. So it's like they make it sound like, oh, it's this popular thing, but, like, too much stuff has gotten out from people who have been in it that it's like unless people are completely lost and broken or something, it's very hard to suck people into it the way it was before.
That's what I was thinking. For me, Mormonism might
Uh,
be the interesting one to talk to, because I think that's the last religion that has really developed in
uh,
the classic sense of theology, to
yeah.
get to the point where it's matching the other older type of globally accepted ones, where you have
Yeah.
things like Scientology coming up. But like, this is the question I ask people: does anyone really imagine there could be somebody who's an open Scientologist running for like a public office, like presidency, and they actually get enough votes? I don't think most people would accept it. Would accept
No.
that Mitt Romney is an open Mormon, and he actually ran for one of the most powerful seats in the world. So that's still one of God's ideas of God that's still at that high level. But the Scientology, yeah, you have celebrities and things like that, but those are that's it's still kind of cultish. It's still treated more like a cult than actual
Yeah.
religion. So I think you'll still have the creation of things that will get to Scientology level, but I don't think there's ever going to be anything else anywhere close to even Mormonism level, let alone Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And Judaism is still a tiny tribe of people. It's,
Yeah.
how many people in the world are actually Jewish? Let me check that.
Yeah. I'd have to look it up.
Maybe like 200 million.
It's pretty low because remember, it's Christianity is officially the largest. Then I want to say it's Islam, then Hinduism, and then I'm trying to think if it's like Sikhism or something, and then it's like
Probably Buddhism.
yeah.
Maybe more Buddhists. 2000, the core Jewish population, those identifying as Jews above all else, is 15 million.
Wow.
That was way lower. I was like 200. I was like, whoa, no, wow, no,
Yeah,
it
it's
can't be
about
50.
double New York City.
Wow, that is
Not even.
very few
Yeah.
people. Yeah, so let me see how many Scientologists there are.
Because like I say, they lie about their numbers. Like they were, I'm trying to remember how many they said there were, but it's like numerically, like they inflate their numbers big time.
Total number of active Scientologists in the world is around 200,000, but
Yeah.
definitely no more than 50,000. Yeah, so that's very insignificant. What was the other one I mentioned?
Mormonism.
Yeah, how many Mormons? Well, you've got like the whole state of Utah. That's a massive amount of people. So it's not even less. Mormons, not seeing the numbers. Mormon population by state, 44,100,000. That translates. The number of Mormons is approximately 444,614 people. Translates to about 26% of. Was it Idaho alone? I don't know.
Well, because Edward has said that they've lied about their numbers too. Like they say their church has been growing. Like Scientology does the same thing. Like they say, oh, our numbers have been growing, all this, but it's like they've actually been losing members over the last few
Okay,
decades.
they're saying recent membership history in LDS is in 2019 is 6,721,032 people. It was plus 0.6% over the last year. So yeah, that's it. I don't think you can see what Scientology's at 50,000. That's what it's at, and it has of course the big public figures that I think make its appearance a lot bigger than it actually is.
Yeah.
But I don't think you'll be able to convince even a million people ever again to believe in
No.
any one classical idea of what a god is. And again, that's why I think it'll be good to have that definition video. So when we're talking about God in that sense, like God, a supernatural being, creator that does something. If you're talking about spirituality and all those things, yes, people are going to constantly believe in some extra force. Do I possibly believe they could be an actual thing that did create us, that actually had direct effect, like how we can go and code a game, or how like if you have an actual child and you just somehow dump that child out in the woods and he has no idea there's other human beings that might have there's something else that created me. Yes, that kind of thing. But I don't think any human being has even touched a scintilla of what that being could actually be. That's my status on that kind of situation. I'm not saying it's impossible for a godlike being to exist. I'm just saying none of the godlike beings that I've heard of seem to make any sense due to the actual things that I believe are actually true. But yeah, so I don't think that kind of God can, with the things that we're talking about, that's what I'm saying, new stories. We need a new storytelling. I don't think religion in the way it was created, that resulted in theologies, that way of storytelling is not convincing enough that you can convince that many people about things anymore. I don't know.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, just one more section in this chapter here. So this is called attachment and rejection. So the need for attachment makes it easy to embrace religion and find difficulty in rejecting it. We want to believe in something loving and eternal. Darwin had a hard time rejecting religion. He was engaged to his religious first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, in the late 1830s, and they married in 1839. He had written his work on natural selection, but it wasn't published for another 20 years. The distancing in their beliefs became more apparent over time, such as when on Sundays his wife and children would go to church and Darwin would walk on his own. It's believed that when Darwin's daughter Annie died from tuberculosis, his religious beliefs died with her. And I wanted to sort of talk about this a little bit because this sort of related to my own experience. I was raised Catholic. My mother's side of the family is pretty religious. And it was tough sort of admitting that I had left the church because, like, I know how much it meant to them. And I knew, like, I would get blowback for this and they'd be really upset. But at the same time, I believe in honesty and I'm not going to live a lie. Like, I'm not going to be one of these people who goes to church and doesn't believe in any of it, or I'm not going to lie and say I went to church when I didn't. So I thought, okay, I'm better off just coming out and saying, look, I'm sorry, but I don't believe this anymore. And, you know, obviously it was tough for me. I had an interesting conversation, though, about this with one of my mother's cousins, actually. I was arguing with my mother about something on Facebook about the church, and he messaged me saying something like, I see you escaped our side of the family's vortex of Catholicism. Congrats on that, or something. And then he said something like, he's like, to better understand their perspective, you have to understand that my grandfather, that is your great grandfather, was the quintessential unstoppable force. He would ram the religion down his kids and grandkids' throats at every opportunity. He would not tolerate any dissent or disagreement. That, of course, showed in how he raised his kids. That is my grandfather and his siblings, and then his grandkids, that's my mother and her siblings. And I guess his cousin's father, he'd be one of my great uncles. He left the church and later in life, but it was like, it was tough to do it. And I guess he got a lot of blowback too. And then this cousin said he left on his own. He's one of those like, oh, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Like, you know, again, I don't know exactly what he means, but, you know, I guess he studied philosophy and other things in school and just a lot of thinking on his own. He's like, a lot about the church wasn't adding up for me. So I had to leave. He's like, it was tough for me too, but, you know, I just had to go my own way. And I said the same thing, like, you know, of course, with all the scandals, people have asked like, oh, did something bad happen to you and a priest? I was like, no, I mean, my experiences were pretty much positive. There were a lot of things that didn't add up, and I asked questions and I get answers like, this is just what our family believes, this is our tradition, this is what I was told, blah blah blah. And it's like, I need better answers than that. So if they can't give me better answers, I have no reason to blindly follow. So it was tough, but like ultimately I was able to leave on my own, and I think I'm in a better place for it because thinking on my own. And look, I was like, you know, if they can come with more compelling answers, I'd consider it. But as of yet, I haven't really received any. And by the way, I still do have a number of close Christian friends, and you know, we still have debates back and forth, but as of yet, I don't see a lot of compelling arguments coming from them. No disrespect to them, but I'm not really convinced. You know?
Same. I have Christian friends, but just you might still be my friends, but just know you're wrong. I like you, but you're wrong. It's interesting with the Emma Wedgwood because I'm just at a part where in the Moral Animal book where they were talking about that as well. Where with him, he had just gone on the trip with the Beagle, and he came back. He came back. She was a year older than him. He came back when he was like 29ish, and he had, even while he was on this 5-year journey on the Beagle, like he was coordinating with his parents and his family, and there was 4 different people he could have married. There was she had 3 older sisters, and there was this other Fanny something person that got married earlier and things like that. But it was just, back then you didn't really have, it wasn't like really a dating scene. You know? It's not like he was like a Tinder or like okay Cupid as he was floating around, and that they're going through the letters and things like this. And the families knew each other, like the first cousins. They knew each other, and they were like, we have a son, you have daughters. These are they knew. They were born, and there were like, there's 10 people you're possibly going to marry. Yeah. And then as people get married, often they go. So it came down to the point where Darwin came back, and he was realizing he was kind of getting ill. He was already back in the environment, and he just made a list. He was like, should I marry or should I not marry? And he realized from the people that it was possibility, there was maybe 2 or 3 people he actually could ask, but he decided he wanted to get married before he actually picked her. And then she was actually more reticent to actually marry him in some sense, but he had certain things where he was kind of, I think they said he might have been aware that he was already getting more sickly. he already knew that he had all this information he wanted to sit down and think about. And in that sense, she was a caretaker, and that was the kind of life she wanted. And her family actually is the one from Wedgwood, China, that is still a very well-known China company making like China,
Oh
the
wow, I didn't know.
pottery and stuff like that. It's kind of like, yeah. So they're still on that. So she was actually from a wealthier family than his, and they had like 10 kids, many kids.
Wow.
But yeah, they didn't mention the religion in the Moral Animal book that much, but interesting to see with that back and forth. But that's also another common thing in cultures in general. The females tend to be more religious, and that's in part due to religion, as we mentioned, being part of a language that passes on the societal norms and gets some kind of organization to certain things, and they're normally part of more cohesive and needing that kind of environment to actually work together with people and not go against the grain. So that's another thing. Are they actually more, do they believe in God stronger, or do they just express and act out the social, because they're more into that social sphere kind of environment? So that's one thing that, how can you really tell with people's beliefs and situations when somebody says it, but then the actions, that's what we said was important. I think they act out religious rituals a lot more than the males do.
Yeah.
I think you'll hear more often a male. Do males convert more? I guess it depends on the religion.
Yeah,
Do
I'd
males
have to look it up.
more
I have
to
no
the
idea.
female's religion, or vice versa? That would be one thing interesting to kind of look into.
Hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting too that he ultimately paved the way for the stuff research into genes, which ultimately showed that inbreeding is bad. But
Yeah, but it's yeah. People didn't know a lot of things back then. We didn't know. There was a lot of a lot
that
of
was like one of the Rucka Ali videos. It's Plato versus Aristotle, and they talk about how Platonism influenced a lot of Christianity, but Platonism talks about like love for young boys and all that. Yet ultimately, Christianity would kill you for those things. So it's kind of
yeah.
ironic. uh,
It,
mm.
yeah. This, yeah. Okay. Interesting. What else was? Is anything else? Is there anything else on that last part? Or are you done?
That's it. I was just gonna go on to chapter 4.
Okay. So
Uh,
you said chapter 1. This was just the intro.
no, this was chapters 1 through 3.
Okay, I
Sorry, was I
thought
not?
so.
Uh,
Okay, so we've been recording for like an hour and a half. So we want to go for another half hour.
yeah, that's good. Sure, we can
How
do that.
many different more paragraphs you got in this part?
So, well, this is chapter. I just read through chapters 1 through 3. Like I said, they're very short. Chapter 4 is maybe like we could do maybe chapters 4 and 5 or something. I don't think they're
Okay.
super long. See how it goes.
Go for it.
All right, sure. All right, let's see here. Okay. That's actually like that's about half the book in terms of chapters, but like I said, the first chapters are short. The second stuff's gonna be a lot longer. Okay. So this is chapter 4, all that is seen and unseen, conceiving souls. And then Darwin says the highest possible stage in moral culture is when we recognize that we ought to control our thoughts. So part of evolution in dealing with people led to us becoming able to make conjectures and assumptions about other people even when they aren't around. This means separating their minds from their physical being. This is often called the mind-body split or dualism. So the medial frontal lobe of our brains, just behind the eyes, contains the circuits for introspection, awareness of our own non-physical attributes, our emotional states, our and traits, our our wishes and desires. It's also part of the part of the brain that reflects on other people's non-physical attributes, i.e., their thoughts, wishes, desires, etc. So this is the medial frontal lobe. Now, the lateral part of the brain does the opposite function. It recognizes faces, bodies, things moving that shouldn't be, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these tendencies are hardwired into us. A 5-month-old who sees a box seemingly move on its own will get startled because something in their brain registers, okay, it's not a living being, but it's moving, and that's not natural. Children demonstrate the mind-body split as well. So a belief in the supernatural isn't something that is taught to us by our culture. It's a byproduct of the way we are wired. Another fact here is that almost all of 4-year-olds have imaginary friends. So that's the idea of like creating minds where they don't exist because you're imagining the mind of someone else that you're interacting with. So understanding the mind-body split and attachment system is one of the first parts of this. Okay, that's all for chapter 4. Did you have any thoughts or comments?
Uh, Same with imaginary friends. Like for me, I draw a lot. Maybe I might
Yeah.
put it up on the screen right now. With my, like, I created this entire universe of characters and people, and it took me some time to realize that this was things based off of my life and my world that were helping me make sense out of my existence, and it wasn't really just and because it was initially based off of Final Fantasy, the game series, and then the other things, and it was primarily because I was having this relationship that was falling apart. So I created this world where me and my current ex, me and the ex, me and the person I was dating at that time, we had a relationship that had struggles, but I was able to fix it within the parameters of those known knowns that I had in that thing, and because there was too many unknowns in actual reality. And just from that, building that up, I finally realized that, oh, I'm not basing it off of that. That other stuff that I thought I was basing this on is actually just the structure that I was trying to make sense. I was trying to, it was actually based on my life and my thing. And I started realizing these characters are not necessarily based off of these characters from the video game. Instead, these are amalgams or people put together of the people that I knew in my life, and to make sense of who these different people were, I was like, okay, they're like that person in this thing. So essentially, I was creating this entire existence, entire universe, and then I still use that. And to me, that ability to do that is similar to that imaginary friends thing. I remember when we were kids, me and my brother, once we left France and we got to Kenya, we used to play in these tents, these forts, this is like blanket forts, and we'd have imaginary characters that we shared. Like I would have like 3 or 4 characters that I'd play. He would play 3 or 4 characters. We'd interact together and things like that. And that's something most people did as kids, but then they become adults and they stop. I
Yeah.
kind of never really stopped. And most people switch that over to their gods and things like that. And they seem to feel there's some separation between that and the imaginary friends and gods. When I say that to a child, the imaginary friend is not true, doesn't exist, but it's still an important being to them. It still helps them make sense of the world,
Yeah.
but they're not real. So with the adults, you can have your imaginary friend, call him Yahweh, call him Allah, call him Jehovah. That imaginary friend can be important to you, can help you make you sense out of life, but they're not real. Just like when I talk about the carbon universe, those characters, I knew when those people aren't real. And there was a time where it was like the concept of the thing was like, what if you wake up and that stuff's actually real? Like, and some of that helped me make sense out of these things. And now I've seen certain things. To some people, Star Wars. To some people, Marvel comics with Superman and Captain America and these characters, Star Trek. These different things have that similar type of, like the Harry Potters. They have this similar type of religious aspect to certain people where they fit in and they fill in that same need. And there's many things that I've seen coming up in books and stories. Even just the Lord of the Rings stories, to me, is a more amazing creation story of how the Earth came to be. Like that was Middle Earth, and then like now Middle Earth, once the elves went away to that other land and things like that, then Middle Earth was left to the humans, and the dwarves kind of went away and things. So to me, that's even more interesting than the Bible and stuff. But I'm thinking there's very many stories that are recently told that were less plot holes, that are more substantial to what we know about the world and the entire field of sci-fi. That is my favorite epic sci-fi. That's my favorite genre of books to actually get into. That kind of field, I see those things that are being created now that are still very valuable and still help people. That if that was just knocked back a few years back, J.K. Rowling would have had her own religion. You know, like George Lucas would have had his own
Yeah.
religion. Like they were just coming up with stories of trying to make sense of human existence, human life, of existence of the reality, and it would help people. And for some people, that's why I think you see some people when they try to change some of these things, they're like, no, Luke is Luke. Like the midichlorians is the Force is the Force. And then for some people, it's like, no, we're just selling toys. But imagine for some Christians, if you're just like, no, Jesus is all of a sudden just some female. Like, where does it matter? Like, some female is going to come up and we're just selling crosses. No, and I think that's something that I think people need to realize. Like, these are stories that are told, and where does it change from just being a story? When does it change from being a religion? When does it change from being something spiritual? When does it change from being belief in a god? Like that's the kind of interesting thing to see that happens in this whole storytelling that we have.
Well, it's
Yeah.
interesting too because Jordan Peterson has mentioned that this is why superhero movies are popular because of the decline in religion, but people feel that need to look up to those magical, powerful figures. And he's drawing from Jungian myth interpretation. I think Jung's myth interpretation was a bit more interesting though, because Peterson mostly ties it into Christianity, whereas I feel like Jung was a bit more broad. Like he talked about why do certain religious themes occur throughout the world and all these cultures that never interacted. Like why do these people have a fertility god? Why do these people have like a thunder god? Why do these people have a god of war? Like all these people who've never interacted, there's certain archetypes that kept reoccurring. We'll get into that a little bit in one of the next sections, but I thought that's interesting. Like the idea that all these people never interacted, yet there's certain themes showing up in their pantheons. And I know when the Romans conquered other people, they didn't mind those other people following their own religions, except the Jews. That's a whole conversation. But because they saw it as, well, okay, the Celts have a war god, the Germanic tribes have a war god. The other tribes have a god king that looks like Zeus. So it's like in their head, they see it as, oh, they're just worshiping our gods, but they're seeing it through the lens of their culture. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, and even before that, it was more like we worship our God because our God is the strongest. And then once a different tribe came by, or different peoples came by and defeated your religion, then you're like, oh, I guess this God is stronger than our God, so we're not going to worship our God anymore, and we're going to move on to this. And that was an excellent thing that the Romans did that managed to keep the people together, was absorb other gods into the pantheon, or have them you're using a different name. I think even eventually they took the names of the Greeks, right? There was a time when they just like switched over them.
The Roman gods are basically copies of the Greek. Like Jupiter is Zeus. Apollo. What was it? Apollo became. I should know this. I know. Well, like Poseidon and Neptune are the same.
Apollo is Mercury, right?
I think so. Yeah.
It's like DC Comics and Marvel Comics, where there's like Superman and there's like the Sentinel. There's like Batman. There's like Iron Man. There's kind of the things where they kind of, in some cases it's just like a direct border where like you just change the color of this character. Like what are you doing, people? But yeah, that's one of the things that does happen.
Mars and Ares were the same. Aphrodite is Venus. Let's see here. Apollo was Apollon in Greek. Hermes was Mercury. That's right. Yeah, Hermes and Mercury. Artemis is Diana. Athena is Minerva. Yeah, I mean it's the same. It's the exact same gods. They're just going by different names.
And of course, one of the differences with the Jews was it was a monotheism, so you couldn't really absorb that into into a pantheon of gods.
Although Judaism was influenced by Zoroastrianism, and Carrier talked about this too, which I thought was interesting. Like, I think I mentioned this in a previous video, but Nietzsche and thus spoke Zarathustra. He picked Zarathustra as his prophet because Zarathustra is another name for Zoroaster, and Zoroaster, as far as we know, is the first major religion that talks about good and evil. And they think that the Jews were heavily influenced by that, because earlier on the Jews practiced what Nietzsche called master morality, and then they started getting into about good versus evil. And also the other thing was sort of the views of the afterlife. Like my understanding is the Jews used to have the idea that if you died, you were just dead, you were asleep. A necromancer could maybe revive your soul. That was it. But the Zoroastrians had the idea of you either go to some blissful eternal paradise or you burn in a fiery situation, for eternity. So like the Jews sort of gradually assimilated that into their own thinking. And then, of course, Christianity picked that up as well.
Yeah. And I think with Christianity, this is part of why I say what we think of as when people say, "Oh, the United States is a Christian country." I'm like, most of the things that you think that most people state are due to Christianity. I'm like, no, Christianity has existed before those things were parts of Christianity.
Yeah.
That Christianity you're talking to is Roman Catholicism, pretty much. And that's a different beast. Roman Catholicism is called Roman Catholicism instead of Christianity because it's not just Christianity. It's a specific sort of Christianity. The Protestant religions the Protestant denominations that we have now came from Roman Catholicism. They didn't come from Christianity. They came from a different animal. They came from something that had already been remixed from the original stuff. Because the whole idea with like the saints and things like that, that was part of that pagan tradition. That was part of that ability of bringing in these other pantheons and having the saint of rivers, the saint of of Assisi, the saint of good health. Like that was those minor gods. That was Apollo. That was Aphrodite. That was the saint of farming. Like that's how it was because people still had that whole thing in their ability. They weren't just able to turn off and be like, okay, it's one God. That one God does everything. Because I think even in their reality, like we don't know, we haven't seen an example of any one entity being able to control so much. So they're not able to countenance that. So it's like, okay, instead of doing that, we have these more personable type of things. You still see that at a personal level. People are in a point where they're like, oh, this, like, you don't live in this area. Like, I just saw this regular protest that's happening right now. None of those police live in our neighborhood. So why do they care about our neighborhood? That was part of that whole thing. People couldn't countenance the universe, couldn't countenance Earth. So they needed somebody more personal. That's why the gods look like the people who worship the gods. That's why, like, the white people worship white people. The Irish people had Irish gods. the Nubian people had the Nubian gods. So it's that kind of familiarity. So with the saints, that was like a bone thrown to people. Yeah, you Italian people, you can have your Italian saints. Oh, you Irish people, you can have your Irish saints. So, so that kind of thing kind of brought people back into that whole fold of something they could visualize with and relate to it. And then as I think the world grew and they could see fewer humans doing more things, it was easier for people to conceptualize that whole idea of like one God being in control of all these things because we could conceptualize in our day-to-day life that we know there might be somebody somewhere else we've never seen who's really controlling all these other things that we're able to actually witness. So if we could countenance a human doing that, of course, a God would be able to do that. And I think monotheism became more palatable to the average person as their awareness grew of things. Yeah.
Well, R and Ra had another interesting point because they always hold up Christianity's popularity as proof of it being right, and he made an interesting, but he made an interesting point on this I hadn't thought about. So a common thing, I think you've experienced this too, is a lot of non-Catholic Christians will say Catholics are not real Christians. They just say they're Mary worshiping pagans, they're corrupted by pagan influence, all this. But here's the thing: Catholics are over half of the Christian population. So you're basically saying half of the people who identify as Christians are not real Christians. So what he was saying is that if you were to separate Christianity and Catholicism, the most popular religion would be Islam, number one, Hinduism would be number two, Catholicism would be three, and the rest of Christianity would be four. Like that's interesting when you really break it down. But the thing is, a lot of people outside of Catholicism say, oh, they're not real Christians. But then, of course, the Catholics say, well, no, those people are heretics. They broke away from our one true church. So it's like, how do you break all that down then? It's like if they all say the others are not real followers. Oh.
And it goes further because some of these people that would say those Catholics are not real Christians for certain differences between their denomination and Catholics. You look at the difference between their denomination and Catholics or their denomination and maybe half of the other denominations, and it's way bigger between those other denominations than the Catholics. So for the same reasons they would state Catholics aren't real Christians, would probably knock out at least 50% of the other denominations. So in actuality, like their definition for it, and that's what I'm saying, there's very few actual people who will agree on what Christianity actually is. And,
yeah.
All
right, so moving on, chapter 5. Let's see here.
One more thing. Do they get into, does he actually, he focuses mostly on the Christian God here, in Christianity in this, or does he get into more of the Asian traditions of gods and things like that?
Not as much. He will talk about Greece and other things and Egypt and so on. He's using the Bible quotes just to sort of talk about certain themes and how they show up, and then he's countering it with something by Darwin to show, okay, how does evolutionary psychology answer this? I guess that's what he's trying to do. Yeah. So like, the book's not explicitly saying this is why we believe in Christianity per se. It's just he's referencing that because these are themes that are familiar to a lot of Christian believers, or growing up in a predominantly Christian country, you've probably heard these sayings. That's what he's trying to do.
Yeah. And for me, because part of my storytelling, I read a lot of manga and I've watched anime, played like the Japanese video games and things like that. And they're based with the Shintoism is the main thing. It's more spirituality. They don't have a full-on pantheon, as most people who are listening to this will know. As recent as World War II, sorry, as recent as
You all right?
Yeah, this had something in my throat. As recently as 1940s, they believed that Emperor Hirohito was a god, was the god, was like actually the god on earth type of thing, like equivalent of Christians would say Jesus, but known, like coming out and like, I'm Jesus and we're all agree. So he was the ultimate. He was an ability of the creator of existence that was there to bring Japan to be the main being of the main humanity. And people really need to actually. I don't, it's like, I've taken the time to really try and imagine that. Like that's not that long ago. You had TV at that time.
Yeah.
Like you were believing they had recordings of that is relatively. It's not even 100 years ago.
No.
People were believing that. So their whole system of gods and faith and belief is kind of different when it comes to like good and evil, like the demons and the afterlife. It's a lot more of a mixed bag, and I think it goes into their form of storytelling, and that's why. In part, that's why I can see that you can have the ability to have civilization and flourishing and culture and involvement without that storytelling. Also, having my background being a Kenyan, of having like the tribal people who I understand our tribal history of religions and things like that isn't as written down as it has been for other people. So people existed there. People believed it definitely wasn't anywhere close to as advanced as some places in Asia, but they had their belief systems before the colonialists came with God. They didn't write down their stuff that much, but humans still existed. There's ways for people to exist without the beliefs in gods, yet very many people who do currently believe find it very hard to believe in existence post belief of God. But you can look at Japan. That's a place where they literally had their God come down and say, actually, I'm not God. We're not the chosen people that are going to take over existence. We're humans, and relatively, they've been a rather productive part of the human experience out post that. And
Yeah.
I think the rest of humanity can learn from that and still be able to tell amazing stories, because you read some of the stuff in the manga and the anime. It's amazing storytelling that they still have there, and still an ability to have a very rich culture and values in society without that dependence.
Sure. All right, so chapter 5, because the Bible tells me so, believing in the invisible. Darwin says, beautiful as is the morality of the New Testament, it can hardly be denied that its perfection depends in part of the interpretations which we now put on metaphors and allegories. A lot of people don't realize, too, that Darwin was basically a clergyman to begin with. Obviously, he fell away from religion later, but, in that context, it makes sense that he would say this. So there's a concept here. It's called decoupled cognition. This is the ability to think about social interactions when they are not happening in front of you. So think about rehearsing what you'll say for an interview or a video, replaying a debate or conflict in your head, lamenting a past mistake, etc., etc. We can decouple our cognition from time, place, and circumstances. This relates to suspension of disbelief, which movies and plays utilize all the time. People will reminisce conversations with loved ones or think about how loved ones who they've lost, how they would go if they were still here. Psychologically, this isn't a far cry from ancestor worship. Thoughts and comments?
Yeah, I would say ancestor worship was probably something that could be a religion, a belief system that I think definitely does not depend on there being a god. It just depends on there being another realm of existence where those beings can be. So yeah, it's the thing. Like, we're building on these things. So even gods themselves built on previous belief systems, because there was things that built up to that, and we're just working our way back to things. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And without that, like, because like we was talking about with Japan, they have a lot of but that was also part tied in because you had like the royal families. But even if you had the royal families, it's not like it's an entire direct line. Like Hirohito wasn't directly line from like the first person who was. So I need to figure how do they switch between the different god lines and things like that to come to that point, that belief system, or is it pretty much more like the pagan type of system where they just bring in different ones? At the point it was like we have the person who's the most powerful warlord or shogun, and then once they take over, then people started having the faith, and like I have the beliefs.
Well, because remember with China, they had many different dynasties. So like there was like the Han, that was their like Roman Empire. I think it was during Roman times, but then that fell and they tried to regain power. I forget if they did or not. Then later on, like I know eventually when Genghis Khan took over, they imposed the Yuan dynasty, which was Mongol, but kind of assimilated Chinese stuff. And then the Ming dynasty, those were the people that overthrew the Yuan, and that became the Ming dynasty, which existed for a few hundred years. And then I'm trying to think if it was the Tang dynasty. There were a few others, and then the last emperor was deposed in the early 20th century, and then that's when you had the communists versus nationalists, basically. So I guess it had to do with who had the most power and basically who could seize it. And then these were our rulers by divine mandate until someone came along.
And that's in China, right?
Yeah.
So
now with Rome, it was a more of an interesting case, and Carrier talks about this too, that a lot of the emperors were declared gods, but a lot of the reason they fell apart was because there was no clear line of succession. Like, remember, Augustus was the first emperor, and he was Caesar's adopted son. I think he was like his grandnephew by blood, and then Tiberius was related to him somehow, and Tiberius took over, but Tiberius was not a son either. So it was basically they would sort of handpick their own successors, but there was no clear line. So it happened where if an emperor was assassinated or died while in power, it would lead to a power struggle. And that's why you had like Year of the Four Emperors and things like that. And they say that's one of the reasons Rome weakened so much was because there was no clear successor. So every time the emperor would die or get killed, it would just lead to civil war. And their longest civil war, I think, lasted 50 years. Like, imagine the American Civil War lasting 50 years. But it's like, how do you build, even maintain a civilization under that? You can't, because it's just every time the leader dies, people just fight among themselves for control. If everybody does that over and over, you're not going to have a civilization.
Yeah, I think with the gods, I think there was a utility to have the gods where when you had the transition of power that was not familial, then you could say, because if you just have the ancestor worship, then you could say, yes, we're staying here because our ancestor is looking over us, and the reason we still have power is because our ancestor has passed on power to us. Now, if you have a different family come in and depose this family, what was the argumentation? Because that family already had their tradition of their ancestors passing on goodwill. And all these people were like, we live here because of this ancestor's goodwill, so we're not going to accept you coming in with this other different goodwill of your ancestors. But now if those people could agree that the ancestors were actually passing goodwill, but not directly from the ancestors, but due to some other force above that, then it was more convenient for them to say, okay, that force has now changed the favor from this line of families and now giving it to this new line of families here. So the land is still under the favor of this being, but then now we can come in. So that's kind of like a practical reason of why that could be useful. And I think it's probably a similar thing like that happened in Japan as well. And the Shintoism that you see right now seems to be a lot more tied into some of the more tribal things, because even there was an indigenous population, for lack of a better term to call them, like this Ainu tribe, is a specific Golden Kamuy is this manga that I read, focusing on these kind of shorter stature people, rather darker skinned. It seemed like most land masses had, because humanity has a variation of melanin on their skin for varied reasons that happen to do with environmental reasons.
Yeah.
But it seems like most places, especially with Japan, is not. I guess there's some places that are rather cold, but they're rather darker skinned people. Just like how you see, like in India, like the actual subcontinent of India, there's some people that are very, like the Brahmin class is normally a lot lighter skinned, and like the untouchables are a lot darker skinned. You can see a wide range. But anyway, the Ainu people, they have a lot more animalism? No, animism. Animism, where it's more like the beings. It's kind of like the Hinduism, where it's like there's gods within things, like the rocks, the bears, the nature. They're more like a hunter-gatherer, rather stronger to it. And I think this comes down to the thing. It's also, you're going to see probably a variation between hunter-gatherer, the nomadic tribes, the different levels of civilization. The gods themselves are also going to have become more, I don't want to say civilized as well, or more intricate, or more.
We'll get into this below, but there's stuff about like when agriculture started, you had various fertility gods and things like that. Whereas it used to be like, oh, a thunderclap, that's this god being angry or clapping or whatever, and then it's, oh, a fertility god. If we pray to them, it'll they'll thank us by giving us rain, which will help the crops grow. Like they knew on some level that water helped crops, but they didn't understand the mechanisms scientifically, like things like that. Yeah.
There's a reason people who lived in the desert didn't have, like landlocked deserts, didn't have ocean gods. Like there's a practical reason for that. Not because ocean gods don't exist, but it's because people made gods for the things they interacted with. Yeah.
All right. So the next one, it's called Theory of Mind Mechanisms. This relates closely to decoupled cognition. So in addition to anticipating what people might say and do, we also have to have an idea of how and what a person thinks. So colloquially, this is called reading people. The better you know the person, the better you're going to do a job of reading them. So this adaptation most likely emerged so our ancestors could better assess who is friend or foe and deal with them accordingly. So you can see if certain expressions a person makes, it might suggest they're unstable. You should stay away from them. They're angry. They might be about to do something. If they need help, you can see that in their eyes, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, again, the better you know them, the better you're going to have a job of doing that. So that was a way of cooperating, better to cooperate with people. And they say this is unique among primates. I mean, again, primates help each other, but it's not clear that they have the skill to read each other's expressions and things the way we do. So thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, it's the social construct that we have to make our biology go in a certain way. Like, there's no reason for, I guess, kind of fish might do it, maybe like a school of fish, but with once there was a reason to be expressive, once you had the facial features to actually express yourself in a certain way, and that kind of gave you a benefit in order to do something, then that was selected for, and then you started building things off of the ability to read people's expressions. Where if we all of a sudden woke up, I think there's apparently a series on, I think, Apple TV or something that I'd seen where like I think it's like some post-apocalyptic type of thing where for generations all the humans have been blind and then a few of them are born with sight, and
I
it's
feel
just
like
like
I've heard this. Yeah.
yeah, it's like a post-apocalyptic society, like 300 years in the future, or after when all humanity became blind. So it's like certain things, like if you have blind humans for a long enough time, there's going to be a time when facial features like expressions will just stop because there's no reason for somebody to
Yeah.
be able to, like, for you to be able to see somebody crying, like somebody's about to cry or somebody's flushing on their face. Like even the whole flushing thing, like there's, or maybe I think maybe something that would happen is we'd probably grow hair back on our faces, because part of the reduction of the hair being grown on our faces, where I think in order to improve your ability to express yourselves in different ways, and not improving that with growing my beard this way, but I think there are certain things that would select for certain. So it's kind of interesting to see what did select for certain gods, what did select for certain face, how much of it is the biology, how many things come to a point where once you've established a social construct that's going to start selecting for certain biological things, and then those biological things coming up could all of a sudden get to the point where they take away that social construct. Like there could be some things that in the West, like Christianity came in and mixed with Enlightenment, got to a point to select for the old way of believing, to find a way to integrate this kind of acceptance of thought and freedom of ideas. But that same environment created a kind of culture and society that would no longer need that older way of thinking. So by them being able to be a society that could use theology, religion, the idea of God in the best way, in a more conducive way to society, also created the end of that God. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's a fictional example, but there was this game, Turok. It was you fought dinosaurs and aliens and other things, and there were actually the creatures called the blind ones. And I was thinking of the, like, sort of what you're describing, where they're blind, but they say their sense of hearing and smell is crazy. Like they could hear like the beating of a human heart, or like smell the blood of an intruder. It's one of those things where it's like, they can't see, but their other senses are so much stronger. They basically know where people are. So it could be like one of those things too.
Is it the Morlock or the Eloi, like the people in the time machine who lived like under the ground?
It's kind of similar to that. Like they say, like
Yeah,
in
Morlocks.
this, well, in this game series, what it was is that, like, think of time as like a waterfall or a bathtub, and the Lost Land is everything that gets caught in the drain pipe. So it's like dinosaurs, humans, aliens, like.
I remember the game. It was one of the earliest, like on N64, right?
Yeah, yeah,
never actually played it, but I do
yeah. I
remember
used to
the
be
game.
hooked on that. I spent too much time playing video games. Okay, moving on. Um,
No such thing. No such thing as too much time playing video games.
So this is an idea. It's called intentionality. Now, let me be clear. The way it's spelled here is it's not with two T's. It's I-T-N-E. Sorry, ITENSIONALITY. So it's intention, like not in, like I have intentions, but intention like intense. If you
Okay.
follow. Okay. So this is an awareness of what other people think and what other people might think about what we think. So example is the first order is I think. Number 2, I think you think. 3, I think you think that I think. 4, I think that you think that I think that you think. So we evolved in a way to sort of anticipate this stuff. So let's apply this to religion. I believe is the first. Second, I believe that God wants. Number 3, I believe that God wants us to act with righteous intent. 4, I want you to believe that God wants us to act with righteous intent. Last one, I want you to know what we believe, that we both believe that God wants us to act with righteous intent. So you keep adding things, and it's an anticipation of what we want from other people and what we think about what other people think. And I have something from James Lindsay here. It was a Solzhenitsyn meme where he said, "We know they are lying. They know that they are lying. They know that we know that they are lying. We know that they know that we know that they are lying, and they still continue to lie." So it's the same basic idea, but one is religion versus a communist system. So
Yeah. Well, what's the difference?
yeah, really. But this is interesting. This relates to what you said earlier about personal beliefs. So the psychologist Robin Dunbar calls the third order of intentionality personal religion. So the third one here was, let me see. Let's see. The third one would be, I believe that God wants us to act with righteous intent. So again, that's a personal belief. For you to be convinced, though, it has to reach the fourth order, which would be, I want you to know that we both believe that God wants us to act with righteous intent. So that adds someone who is asking you to believe the intentionality. This is called social religion. However, even this doesn't commit you to anything. If you add the fifth one, this creates communal religion, because then people can demand obligations and certain behaviors from you. So
what was that fifth one again?
So let's see here. I believe that God wants us to act with righteous intent. I want you to believe that God wants us to act with righteous intent. And then fifth, I want you to know that we both believe that God wants us to act with righteous intent. So you're adding in additional people who expect things from you, whereas the initial ones are more about just what you personally believe. And then maybe you might add in one or two additional people.
That's where we are now with the most reactionary and disruptive aspects of the progressive, regressive, leftist, however you want to call it, movement in most of the West. And in most of the westernized world, I'm trying to figure out a better term for that. I want to say modernized world, because I guess postmodernism type of thing. There's modernism, where I think there's this level of civilization that was considered modern, and then there's certain levels that are trying to go to postmodernism. I'm thinking of a certain term like posthumanism or post-anthropomorphism, or there's something else that I'm trying to figure out in a sense. But getting to this point where it's not that I believe there's 52 genders. It's like I believe that there's an existence that, for the greater good of humanity, we all have to believe there are 52 genders. Not like, if you want to believe there's 52 genders, go ahead. If I want to believe that I have an imaginary friend named like Damien that travels around to different dimensions and does all these things, like by coming into different times and helping me make sense of my world, that's okay. But I don't have to have you believe that. You don't have to say hello to Damien every time I walk into a room. But the problem right now is that people are coming in and saying the dragonkin, I'm half dragon, half this and that, and they're saying we have to say that they are that way. And it's like, no, I don't. I'm not going to. Like, I can come to a different point where it's in a different situation to make some sense. If I'm having a certain interaction with you, I can choose to participate in this, but demanding other people participate in it is not a positive thing. That's something that, to me, kind of irks me when people are demanding that other people affirm their belief system, and I'm like, no, that's an imposition on other people's lives that I don't think is appropriate to have. It's not healthy.
Yeah, we'll get more into it, but also we'll get into things about rituals and group binding, and I think it sort of ties into that as well, like the idea of this intentionality, but also like different groups, and there's a sense of identity in the group. And like Wilfred Riley mentioned, the whole thing about being oppressed as part of your identity and how all this ties together, and it becomes a reinforcing mechanism, both psychologically and socially, which we'll get into. Um, so it's believed here that this intentionality on joint action may even be the basis of language. You know, the idea that you have to sort of anticipate what other people think and want, and you have to be able to find a way to communicate that. Again, we don't know exactly how language began, but that's a theory. This shows up in our other behaviors, such as reading eye gazes, and this is why eyes have been called windows to the soul. Simon Baron-Cohen, Borat's cousin, has studied this and found that people can identify hundreds of emotional states simply by looking at eyes. I don't know if you ever saw that show Lie to Me, but it was about detecting criminals, and there were people who just specialize in yeah, it kind of reminds me of that. Like, we evolved to pick up on all that stuff because you think about it in the past, like, I know there was an episode where there was a sniper in the audience and they'd be able to quickly identify them. And it's like, that's built out of that survival instinct. If you have to quickly identify who the enemy is, because if you don't, they could kill you before you get a chance. So that's why we evolved to pick up reading those cues and things like that. Yeah.
I wonder how much that crosses across the cultures, because I don't know if it's because I spend a lot of time online, but I don't really seem to care too much about those cues. And I'm thinking it could be in part due to some of these things being rather different culturally. So if you move from France when you're 5 to Kenya, to Nairobi, and then you move to the United States when you're 11, then you have to relearn different cues and faces. So, but if you live in one place, you've seen the 1,000 people in that same area kind of give the same expression or make the same noise or have the same kind of body movement when they're about to be tense, when they're about to be angry. So you get used to that. But for me, it was a different thing in different places. So I was kind of like, okay, I don't really need to rely on that much because I'm getting mixed cues from it. So I'm more focused on trying to understand what are you saying? Like, I'm more into the words like, okay, you said this, but do you really mean this? Like, what do you mean by that intentionally? And there's something that I added on with that intentionality thing, that's from the Princess Bride thing, that whole thing was like, you keep using that word, but I don't think that word means what you think it means. I went even further because that's something else. Like, I do think people do believe that word means what they think it means. Like, so when they say that line, because in that case you're saying you should be using a different word or you're thinking of something else. Like, no. In my experience, when I meet people, I've gotten to the point where I don't think that they think that they think what I would need to think to say that word. So it's kind of like when somebody says they're hungry or they're starving. To me, starvation means an actual thing. Like, I've done things where I've done a 5-day fast before, and like you can really feel like that sense of starvation actually means I'm tying it to an awareness of an actual physical, biological state with like empirical evidence of what your body's actually physically going through. But for most people in the West who say that word have never actually thought the status of being hungry. Maybe outside of childhood, and that ties into that whole thing of part of why they're trying to seek attention and try to say they're hurt and constantly, because even as children, we understand we're self-centered in a sense. But if we see another being, if we are in pain, we notice that actually gets us attention. We notice that we also give attention to things that are in pain. So if you're living in society and you're feeling very lost in this massive infosphere of all these unknown things, that known unknowns, I think people feel like, oh, I don't know what to do with myself, so I'm going to put myself in the position of I am hurt, I'm a victim, and in that way I will get attention to me in that way. And by that way, I can also focus on, I don't have to focus on these things, I'm going to focus on these victims. And that's something that's hardwired into us. But coming back to what I was saying with the thing where when somebody says they're starving, they don't think, they don't feel or think they're physically in a sense of biological starvation that word has meant. But what they think that word means is a situation which is normally just like I haven't eaten in like 10 waking hours.
I'm literally starving, and it's like it's been like a few hours. Yeah.
So pretty much, they do think that word. What they think that word means, what it means, and they're accurately in a sense. So when somebody says something racist has happened, it's just that to them they think racist means something else. So they're completely accurate. That's why I say, like, I don't think that they think what I think that word means. So it's, to me, to think something is racist, something else would have to happen, but to them it is. So it's kind of an extra reality
I
to it.
forget if I've talked to you. I've talked to Edward about this as well, about the whole idea of some of these victim ideologies. It's also people seeking status. Because if you think about it, high quality people don't buy into this stuff. Because think about it this way, like, you know, a very attractive woman who has healthy relationships with guys, she's not going to be drawn to feminism because it's like she has a good circle of female friends. If she dates guys who treat her well, you know, guys are interested in her. Why is she going to be drawn to feminism? Like, what is it doing for her? Like, look at like Phyllis Schlafly or somebody. It's like, you know, happily. But well, like what I'm getting at is that there's other women that in a more traditional setting, like I think of like the femcel types, they're not going to be wanted by guys, so they're in turn going to be resentful, so they're going to crave some sort of status or recognition. So if they have a circle of friends who agree with them and they're respected in that circle, they're higher status within that circle, whereas like in a more traditional setting they'd be rock bottom. So it's sort of that like seeking status and like need for meaning and all that. That's what I mean, I think that's part of it, but depends.
But wasn't first wave feminism mostly rather upper class people? Like even in the book that I'm reading,
Yeah.
Moral Animal, like it turns out John Stuart Mill's wife was like a very active feminist
Yeah.
while she was alive. It's like, oh, John Stuart Mill, no. like, so there were some things where it was kind of just more like the fashion line. And again, as we were talking about with the series that we just did previously with Marcuse, it was like based off of different information. We're talking about in the Roman times, when based on the information that they had at that time, they didn't really have the fuller picture of the cost benefit analysis. How there's what's the thing that Thomas Sowell says, trade-offs. There's trade-offs where it's like, yes, men have certain benefits in certain areas, but they also have responsibilities in those areas. Women have certain benefits in certain areas, but they also have responsibilities in those areas. You have a thing where it's like, okay, it's not okay to hit women, but then women are also responsible to be more demure and more accountable and more himself. It wasn't like, you're not allowed to hit women, but women can also just go around yelling at men in their face and just being in their face and like, you need to do this, you need to do this, and you need to just go starting things with people and then running home so other people. No, it was like, okay, you have certain responsibility. Since you're not allowed to have physical violence upon you, you need to treat yourself in a certain way so you're not in a situation where you're instigating physical violence upon other people around you. So it's the kind of situation. But then in a man, it was like, okay, you're allowed to have physical violence around you, so you need to watch the hell what you say out there, because if you say a certain thing in a certain way, somebody might just punch you in the face. So but at the same point, you can be more authoritative and be out there on your own because you're responsible. So those are kind of trade-offs that actually exist in that kind of environment. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and that relates to the earlier point about codependency. And like he even says, he's like, in a very true sense, we're still interdependent to this day. Like, I didn't build this computer from scratch. I'm not generating the electricity on my own. All this, it's a question of, are we dependent on each other through the market and it's voluntary versus is it being forced by the government? And of course, you know, we definitely prefer the former category. Yeah.
Or is it God?
All right, so one last section. This will wrap up chapter 5. So this is called transference, and this relates to attachment. We base our relationships on earlier relationships, good or bad. Even as adults, we relate to authority figures the way we did in our formative years. For example, if we were treated badly, we may be more skeptical of future authority figures because of prior experiences. What is the reason for this from an evolutionary point of view? It's to assign feelings and attitudes associated with important figures earlier in our life in order to anticipate future outcomes. Imagine if we had to relearn how to relate to people each time. You know, it's not productive or worthwhile. So one of the ways psychotherapists help treat their patients is to show them ways in which troubled earlier relationships are distorting their current relationships. And this shows in how certain familial relationships get carried into religious themes. So you see God the Father, Mary the Mother, Jesus the Son, etc. Thoughts and comments?
This is when I was coming through, I had some tough time really coming to terms that I just really didn't believe this because it's been indoctrinated into believing certain things. One of the hardest things to let go of was that hell. There was that constant thing where it's like, if I don't convince myself to believe this, I'm going to be damned in hell, because the horror seemed to be a lot easier to believe than the positive. And there's a lot more in part to do to just human nature of being aware of the threats. And you don't really need to describe what a excellent, perfect, comfortable day is, but you really need to be aware of what a horrific day is so you can do anything you can to avoid that horrific day. You know the steps when things come to be horrific. So it makes sense that we pay more attention to the dark things. Then you go into things like Dante writing about the Dante's Inferno. writing about
Circles of
hell,
hell and all that.
the divine comedy, yeah, writing about the stories of how hell is. There's a lot more information. That's even the Bible itself doesn't get that much into hell,
No.
or I think it's mentioned like 7 times or something. Heaven's mentioned a few times, but there's no details.
No.
I remember back when I was still trying to believe, I was asking, what kind of houses do you think? Was it going to be like classical Roman architecture? If somebody was like died before that and believed and only lived in a mud hut, is he all of a sudden going to have electricity? Like, is there going to be internet? What were people thinking? And most people, I don't know if they've actually gone into that mental exercise of trying to imagine what it would be like, let alone the whole aspect that if it's infinite, it's just going to be horrific. Even when back then when I tried to read, I couldn't imagine doing anything infinitely. But anyway, so I was getting to that point, trying to understand, trying to get away from that point. But I was realizing that when I was trying to grow the carbon universe and start thinking this is more about my life, thinking about different religions and trying to get to an understanding before I started going to these academic people going into it, I was trying to think like the animists were just talking about what they were talking about in their locations. As societies were growing, the gods would be in their image, not necessarily just if I'm black, my gods are black, but if we are polygamous, our gods are polygamous. If we're monogamous, our gods have some look favorably upon monogamy. You don't have a monogamous, like polygamous culture that all of a sudden like worships a monogamous god.
No.
Like no, the culture becomes monogamous for actual practical reasons of the society before their god starts accepting monogamy. And you just look at the attempt of trying to take trying to take gods that are supportive of monogamy into cultures that have been selected for polygamy. It's not successful.
Well, and like I mentioned in a previous point too about how you think about the Greeks and the Romans glorifying war, but they were the powerful people. The Jews, of course, said the opposite, and then obviously once they gained power, it became Christian soldiers, and in the name of Christ, we're reclaiming this land and all this. But again, it's the same thing of like, okay, if let's say Jesus existed or he was some sort of based off a few people, well, a poor faith healer is not going to lead an army. So naturally, he's not going to be glorified as some sort of warrior hero. Whereas like Muhammad was a warlord. So there's things like that too.
Yeah. And another thing, they seemed, there's a positive to have a God you can visually relate to. It's easier to market and have people latch on to that visual. But then there's also that negative of the God looks like someone. He looks like a surfer. He looks like a Caucasian surfer. And then eventually people can be like, what was a Caucasian surfer doing in the Middle East?
Did you ever see Agora? Did we talk about that?
Yeah, because Rachel Weisz is in it, and Rachel Weisz is amazing to look at. She's also a good actress, but she's awesome to look at.
I like one of the earlier scenes when the Christians and the pagans are taunting each other, and one of the Christians goes, their gods behave like humans. They eat, drink, and fornicate. And then the guy goes, if my gods eat, drink, and fornicate, good for them.
The different values of the people, like they're matched in the actual gods. That with the visuals, like if you can't depict Muhammad, then a lot of people can't really get to the point where like Muhammad doesn't look like us because he's just like this kind of being. And they had the point where they say you still have to read in Arabic, even if you don't understand Arabic. There's many Muslims who will only learn it just so they can read that. It's an interesting kind of situation, and that has been a big question mark for a lot of religious people. And that's one of the few things with Christianity that's it's one of the things that will, I think, detonates Christianity, that makes it kind of done. Like they established too much of their mythos on blonde, blue-eyed Mary and surfer Jesus. It's been too core to their marketing that to roll that back now, but at the same point, the different people, did the African, like when the colonialists brought that new god to the Africans, I guess they also jumped through. A lot of those Africans were still an animist type of ancestor worship type of thing, so they hadn't gotten to the point of visualizing some kind of supernatural beings that looked like them, that were separate. There was no like, we were created in the image of this supernatural being. And that was part of why they had to do that, because you could not really market that sort of Christianity to Europeans in general. If it was like people would take that literally, we're made in his image, and then you show them an Arab man that's like from the place where you're constantly at war with, like, then they're going to be like, hey, we can't really buy that. So in order to make it more palatable for their predominantly European masses, like they had to have somebody that looked like them for them people to relate to. And then by doing that, they've kind of painted themselves into many corners with the whole situation where it's like, right now people are like, no, he didn't look like that. So it's a tough situation to get into.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen Asian Jesuses as well, or GZI. I don't know what the
Yeah,
grammatically.
I've seen Asian Jesus, I've seen Black Jesus,
Uh,
I've seen Indian Jesus. And that's the thing. I'm kind of wondering, like, what is God? Like, is God like some kind of hermaphroditic, omniracial type of being? Like, because are women made in His image, or is women a different being? Like, this is the kind of thing.
yeah.
It's weird though. That's what I'm saying. New stories, and this is a question that I've asked people. Even from the little that we know about the universe, why would anyone think that? And maybe because it's the only life form that we know, so maybe the only way sentient life can exist is in a bipedal form because that's all we kind of know right now.
Mhm.
But I think we can already imagine many different better forms to be able to exist in the universe that we know of. Being metallic, having multiple arms, having the ability to communicate over like Wi-Fi, which is essentially telepathy, like telekinesis. Like there's other things we can think of that we're already able to kind of achieve through machines. We're already able to create entities, beings that can exist in places the human body can't exist on Earth. So why would people think that a God that can create exist in the universe would be in a form that can only exist on a very limited part of this single planet? Like it's,
Yeah.
and I'm saying if I can think of this, there's at least 100 million other people that can think of this rather easily. Probably more. There's at least billions of people that can. Surely, there's billions of people that can think about this. So I'm thinking it's like even if you want to believe in God, we need new gods. We need new stories. But yeah.
All right, so that's the end of chapter 5. I figured you want to stop now. I mean, we're going in about.
Yeah, we can call it now. It's about
Yeah,
two
sure.
and a half hours. I think that'll be
So,
good.
so
A good
in terms
healthy.
of chapters, that's half the chapters, but I mean, it's only like a quarter of my notes because it's like I say, the next ones are much longer.
Okay.
These are just sort of like the first few chapters are kind of the intro, and then then it gets further in depth with neuroscience and stuff.
Okay.
All right,
So with this one, I think we'll call it a day here.
sure.
As I mentioned, we shall have one. If you can think of other definitions, like I said, the definition: faith, belief, God, religion, and theism. I want to get one where we get like just the I'm just going to probably get like Merriam-Webster, Oxford, or something, and just read the definitions of those, and just be more specific. If you can think of any other terms that you think might be helpful to be having the definition, and with that one, I'll try to record that as soon as possible and post that up in no particular order. But we shall be back soon to continue the series.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all I have. Yeah, sure.
All right. So that's it from now, guys, girls, and everything else in between. Thank you for spending your time listening to this with us. As I mentioned, links below to the actual article. And that's it for me. Yeah.
That's all I have too. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you enjoy and didn't take anything too personally.
And even if you did, we don't care.
Oh.
Okay.